Greetings from our side and a warm and jovial welcome to our today's class in biology. I want to introduce to you a new topic, and this topic is called evolution. It is our second topic in our Form 4 biology coursework. And in as far as this topic is concerned, we are going to look at the following parts or subtopics. The first subtopic is definition of terms. We shall define terms such as evolution and be able to define organic evolution and define the special creation and the chemical evolution as just part of what you are going to actually encounter in our discussion as far as this topic is concerned. Number two, we shall be able to look at the origin of life. Where did life originate or come from? Where did the plants come from? Where did animals come from? Where did the members of kingdom fungi such as mushroom, yeast, toadstool, bracket fungi, puffball, and others come from? Where did the members of kingdom Monera, the bacteria, come from? Where did the members of kingdom Protoctista, such as Paramecium, Plasmodium, we have Vorticella, we have the Spirogyra, we have what you call the Trypanosome, and others come from? Even the sarcasm, we have what you call the seaweeds and the diatoms. Where did they come from? The algae, that are actually the green coloring living organisms found in water that actually help to synthesize food for the aquatic animals. You see, so at the end of the day, we are also going to actually embark on looking at evidences of evolution. How do we tell that an organism has evolved? How do we tell that an organism has undergone drastic changes? So evidences of evolution. I'll also be able to introduce this. I'll also be able to explain to you some of the theories that also give us enough evidence in as far as evolution is concerned. We have what you call the Lamarck's theory and the Charles Darwin's theory. So those are the main areas that we are going to look at in detail so that you can be able to actually be able to bring out a clear picture of what this topic says. So I'll first begin by looking at the origin of life. So origin of life. If I can go to some of those terms and be able to explain or define them. So origin of life. Where did life come from? You see? So life and everything within the universe must have come from a particular source. Where did life or forms of life and everything within the universe come from? You'll realize that there are different life forms that you can find on the Earth's surface. So some of the life forms that we have include plants. As I've actually told you, we have animals. We have members of kingdom fungi. I've talked about mushroom, toadstool, yeast, bracket fungi, puffball, penicillium. So members of kingdom fungi such as toadstool. And of course, all members of kingdom fungi are non-grain. So they cannot be able to rely on what you call photosynthesis to make their own food. They actually rely on a process called chemosynthesis to manufacture food. And that means they are supposed to oxidize chemicals within their structures so that they can be able to actually end up making food. Others do not make their own food. So they are heterotrophic, to mean that they actually rely on what has already been manufactured. So they can be parasitic or saprophytic. Parasitic means they actually live on or in the substrate, and they obtain nutrients from that substrate using special structures. And some can be saprophytic, to mean they can actually be able to obtain nutrients from a dead decaying matter causing decomposition. And another life form can be members of kingdom Monera, and more specifically, these are bacteria. And you can also talk about members of kingdom Protoctista. So some of these members can be the amoeba, the amoeba. We have what you call the plasmodium. We have what you call the paramecium. We have what you call the sargassum. We have what you call the seaweeds. We have what you call the diatoms. We have what you call the chlamydomonas. Chlamydomonas. We have what you call the spirogyra, among others. We have the vorticella. All these are actually examples of members found under kingdom Protoctista, or also referred to as Protista. So apart from vorticella, you can also talk about this called trypanosome. Very good. Trypanosoma. Very good. So those are actually examples of what you can actually give in as far as members of kingdom Protoctista are concerned. So regardless of the type of the life form we are referring to, we need to actually ask ourselves, where have these life forms originated from? Look at that. So all these life forms that I've just mentioned here are able to differ. They differ in terms of what? They differ in terms of, one, the shape. They don't have the same shape. Let me just give a practical example. If you look at Chlamydomonas, it has a cup-shaped appearance. It has a cup-shaped chloroplast. So it can photosynthesize. It can make food. Look at that. If you look at an amoeba, it has a structure that is just simple. So it is unicellular. It is single-celled. It is made up of one cell. So it has just a membrane that has to surround whatever is inside it. And in that case, it is unicellular. It is made up of one cell actually. So some of these organisms or these life forms are unicellular, while others are multicellular. So they actually differ in terms of, one, the shape. They differ in terms of size. As I've actually told you, some are unicellular while others are multicellular. So unicellular while others are multicellular. Now, a practical example. Plants and animals are multicellular. They are actually made up of millions of cells. Their structures are physically able to get seen. We don't need a microscope to actually look at an animal like a human being. Animals are actually physically able to get seen. You don't need a microscope or even a hand lens. So plants and animals, as just examples you can give in this case, are multicellular. And some life forms like bacteria and some members of kingdom fungi like yeast are unfortunately unicellular. Even viruses are also unicellular, but they actually form their own category. So viruses are also unicellular. So viruses in their own category, bacteria under kingdom Monera, and some members of kingdom fungi like yeast are actually unicellular, including amoeba as a member of kingdom Protoctista are unicellular. So in terms of size, some are unicellular, made up of a single cell, while others are multicellular, made up of millions of cells. At the end of the day, this whole list that consists of life forms can actually end up having differences in terms of shape, size, and structure. Differences in terms of shape, size, and structure. Just a good example. You have actually been told that plants have cells and their cells have a regular shape, while animals have cells whose structure will appear to be irregular. So plant cells are regular in shape and larger in size. Animal cells are irregular in shape and smaller in size. So in terms of structure, these organisms differ. These life forms also end up differing. So shape is one of the factors to consider, size and as well structure. And to actually just proceed forward, you'll also understand that apart from differing in terms of shape, size, and structure, these life forms can also differ in terms of the habitats they occupy. They differ in terms of shape, they differ in terms of size, they differ in terms of structure, and as well differ in terms of the habitats, in terms of where they actually get found in our environment. Now, there are those that actually have the same habitat. For just a clear clarification on this, we'll actually realize that some members are found in an aquatic environment. So in terms of habitats, we have either aquatic habitat, or you can talk about terrestrial or land, or you can talk about those that can get found in the desert, or semi-arid and arid. That's why if you talk about plants, you talk about halophytes, the plants found in salty areas. You know, if you look at the mangrove trees, they are found along the coastal region. And of course, in the sea, we expect to find a higher concentration of salts. So mangrove trees can be found in an area where there's actually much salt. So they're actually halophytes. If you talk about hydrophytes, they are those plants found in areas where there's much water. You can talk about the water lily, the water hyacinth, and some other plants. They are found in areas with much water. We have those plants found in the desert or in arid and semi-arid areas, like the acacia. Those plants and even the cactus are in areas where there's an inadequacy of water. They are referred to as xerophytes. So I've talked about halophytes to refer to the plants found in areas where there's much salt. Halophytes, like the mangrove. I've talked about the hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are found in areas where there's much water. Hydro. So I'm hydrated. I am dehydrated. I have actually taken in enough water. So hydrophytes are found in areas with enough water, like the water lily. We have what you call xerophytes. Xerophytes are found in arid and semi-arid areas, like the acacia and the cactus. Those are xerophytes. Then we have other plants called mesophytes. Mesophytes are the normal terrestrial plants, like the maize, the beans, the mango trees, the banana plants, and others. So mesophytes are the normal terrestrial plants we grow on our farms. They are found in a normal area in terms of the ecological conditions, like getting an average amount of rainfall, moderate temperatures, and the air is not so windy. So those are the conditions necessary for any plant to survive in a mesophytic environment. Or mesophytes are plants found on the normal land you actually have to have in an environment as far as growing of these plants is concerned. So now at the end of the day, why do we have different life forms, differing in terms of shape, size, structure, and even the habitat? You see, at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, what would be the main reason for this? And to proceed forward, we are going to give explanations of the origin of life forms and anything within the universe. Now, the origin of life has been an area of discussion, debate, or contention. But now, to just move forward, we realize that there are three very important theories, speculations, if I may call them, with enough evidences, you see, that try to explain the origin of life. We have what you call the folklore or mythical. Look at that. The second theory is what we call the special creation theory. So you have what we call the folklore explanation, the special creation theory, and the third one is called the chemical evolution theory. So those are the three main theories that try to explain to us in as far as the origin of life is concerned. Where did plants come from? Where did animals come from? And where did the other life forms come from? And anything within the universe, where did it come from? Those three theories are going to give us more information in as far as the origin of life is concerned. And if I can just go to this, let me just try to explain some of these terms found in this topic. We have what you call organic evolution. I want us to actually explain or define this phrase. What is organic evolution? Organic evolution, in few words, is the emergence of complex life forms from pre-existing simple life forms gradually over a long period of time. So emergence, from the word emerge, emergence, the emergency or the emergence of simple, or you can say complex life forms, the emergence of complex life forms, the emergence of complex life forms from simple, or you can say from pre-existing simple life forms gradually over a long period of time. The most important words to remember in our definition are these: emergence of what? Complex life forms from pre-existing simple life forms. And it was a gradual process, but now over a long period of time. Let me give you this example. You see, if I talk about how man evolved, you can talk about, for example, let's look at the last three stages. We have what we call Homo habilis. Okay, we have Homo erectus, and you have what you call Homo sapiens. So if I consider these three stages of evolution, you'll understand that this is a complex life form, and this is the pre-existing simple life form. So the whole of this process is called organic evolution. What is it? Emergence of complex life forms. This is a complex life form that has emerged from pre-existing simple life form. This one here. Gradually, it has been a gradual process from one stage to another. So from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, then from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. So a complex life form has emerged from a simple life form. A complex life form has emerged from a pre-existing, that means which had initially existed. So a complex life form called Homo sapiens, now the modern man, emerging from a pre-existing simple life form. If you compare a Homo habilis and a Homo sapien is more developed, more complex. Look at that. More advanced. So a complex life form is emerging from a pre-existing simple life form gradually. It was a gradual process from one stage to another, gradually over a long period of time. It is believed that these stages must have actually taken at least more than millions of years for them to emerge. So gradually over a long period of time. Now, in that case, that means we can look at evolution as a focal point in as far as the origin of life is concerned. In terms of the great diversity of organisms and the way they differ in terms of structure, size, shape, and habitats, in terms of where they're actually found, we can be able to actually use evolution to explain the origin of life. Where could this be? Or where could this be all about in terms of the origin of living organisms or all forms of life and whatever is found in the universe? Now, in that case, we are going to actually tailor down and look at each and every theory in terms of how it can explain to us the origin of life. But just know, organic evolution means a complex life form emerges from a pre-existing simple life form, but now through a gradual aspect or process over a long period of time. Now, we are going to begin our discussions of the origin of life by looking at what we call the folklore or the mythical theory. That is the first theory that explains to us the origin of life. So we have what we call folklore or mythical theory. Okay, we may not talk much about this, but traditionally, culturally, when you go back to our societies, we can realize that each and every community believed in a particular way that life existed or life originated from at least one source. Let me give you a practical example. You know, if you go to the Agikuyu in the central region of this country, you'll realize that they believed that their first man and their first woman must have actually come from a mountain called Mount Kenya. That's why if they're making any prayers, they have to face that mountain. And if you go to the other tribes like the Nandi, that form part of what you call the Kalenjins, they believe that there first existed a particular man whose knee had to undergo some swelling. And after some time, the swelling ended up bursting. And from the swell, the first man and the first woman came out. So those are just mythical stories, folklore. They tell us more about a particular community and how they believe in as far as the origin of life is concerned. You know, each and every community will have its own explanation of the origin of life. It is all about or based on faith and the ability to believe in that story. So some are criticized because in a layman's language, they may not make sense to us. But at the end of the day, they are what will make part of what you call our cultures and beliefs. It's something called diversity. We have to embrace that. At the end of the day, we have to believe in that. So folklore or mythical stories tell us more about the origin of life, where a particular community has its own way of explaining the origin of life. So, one, in as far as this theory is concerned, you have to know this, that each and every community has its own way of explaining the origin of life. They believe in a particular aspect. They believe in a particular story. They have a particular explanation they will always present to us in as far as the origin of life is concerned. I've given an example. It's all about based on what people tell you in as far as that community is concerned. So the elders, the elderly, would always narrate these stories, these narratives to the young generation, explain to them how life began. And those stories have some truth, you see. And every elder had to get held accountable for each and every story they were to actually tell. Although sometimes these stories can actually be able to end up getting distorted, they can have some sort of exaggeration, and some very relevant information can get omitted, and they are passed from one generation to another. Now, if you go to the other theory, it is called the special creation theory. One thing you need to know, for a very, 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 very long time, in as far as the special creation theory is concerned, it is believed that a great variety of organisms came into existence through creation. A great variety of organisms and anything found in the universe came into existence through creation. All these stories of how creation or making something out of nothing, you see, are brought to us in holy books. And the holy books here are one, the Bible and the Quran. So the Bible and the Quran tell us more about the creation or the making of everything out of nothing and bringing everything into existence by a supreme being. A supreme being, and that supreme being is God. Look at that. A supreme being, listen to this. A supreme being, referred to as God, created everything, both on earth and in the universe, including all forms of life, out of nothing. All this has been captured in holy books like the Bible and the Quran. So, in as far as this theory is concerned, everything was created. Everything was brought into existence out of nothing by a supreme being called God. And all this has been captured in holy books such as the Bible and the Quran. This theory has some principles. Principle number one is that life was brought into existence by a supreme being. So the first thing, life brought into existence. Life brought into existence by a supreme being. And of course, that is God. Life was brought into existence by a supreme being. Now, everything that was created, in as far as this theory is concerned, was created in a perfect form and has remained unchanged. Look at that. Everything that was created by that supreme being, in as far as this theory is concerned, was created in a perfect form, was created in a perfect manner, and everything created has remained unchanged over time. Remained unchanged over time. So whatever God created does not need to undergo evolution, does not need to undergo any drastic changes. Whatever God created was created in a perfect manner or form and has remained unchanged over a long period of time. That's the second principle of this special creation theory. Now, this theory is based on faith, and cannot be disputed or contradicted, Okay, anything religious, anything that concerns God, the Holy Spirit, and His Son Jesus Christ, and whatever you have to actually get attached to as far as religion is concerned, cannot be disputed. You cannot criticize. You cannot question. So whatever has to get captured in the holy books, like the Quran and the Bible, cannot be contradicted, cannot be disputed, cannot be able to get questioned. It is all about faith. Your faith, your faith, your faith. Iman in Islamic religion is what actually matters a lot in as far as this theory is concerned. So whatever has to get captured in special creation theory in terms of the origin of life is based on faith and cannot be disputed or contradicted or criticized. Now, and you need to understand this. You cannot contradict this. You can't actually contradict. You cannot even use science. Many scientists have actually tried to actually understand God, but they have ended up actually getting to that point of not being able to find a clear picture of who God is and how creation was done. So you can't contradict that theory by science, and that is why it is scientifically not testable. You cannot test this theory. It is scientifically not testable. So the theory is scientifically not testable. So the theory, the special creation theory, is scientifically not testable. You cannot be able to test this theory. So it is scientifically not testable. So that's actually all about the special creation theory. I'll actually focus on something else, and this is what you call the chemical evolution theory. This is the third and the last theory, if we can go to the evidences of evolution. So with the chemical evolution theory, it gives us a scientific view. So the first theory, which is the folklore or mythical, gave us a traditional view of the origin of life. The second theory, called the special creation theory, gave us a religious view of the origin of life. And the chemical evolution theory is going to give us a scientific view of the origin of life. So please try to actually get a clear picture of all those three theories. So the theory we are actually going to look at, called the chemical evolution theory, is going to give us a scientific view of the origin of life in terms of the scientific explanation, in terms of the way the scientists may look at it, what could be the possible origin of life. So the chemical evolution theory supposes that life probably began through what you call a catalytic effect of lightning. Lightning would have actually served as a catalyst at one point, and through its catalytic effect, it might have actually brought together some elements to form simple molecules. Let me just give an example here. So scientists have gone ahead and tried to explain to us the origin of life by telling us that we have to actually hold on to the scientific view of the origin of life by telling us that there was lightning. This lightning must have acted as a catalyst. Of course, a catalyst is a substance that speeds up a particular reaction. You know, in chemistry, for example, we will always go back to Form 1 work. We were told that when zinc reacts with dilute hydrochloric acid in the process of making or actually preparing hydrogen gas in the laboratory, we require calcium sulfate as a catalyst to speed up the reaction. If you go to what we call the Haber process under nitrogen and its compounds, you'll be told that iron, which is finely divided iron, can be used as a catalyst in the process of combining nitrogen and hydrogen to form ammonia. If you go to a different area, like sulfur and its compounds, you'll be told that platinum rhodium catalyst or platinized asbestos can be used as a catalyst, you see, in a mixture manner to speed up the formation of sulfur 6, you see, oxide, you see, or to speed up the way sulfur 4 oxide can get formed during the manufacturing of sulfuric 6 acid. Look at that. So all these processes demand the availability of catalysts. Even in the manufacturing of nitric 5 acid, we require a catalyst, which is platinum, you see, to oxidize ammonia to nitrogen 2 oxide, so you can be able actually to give it a chance of getting further oxidized to nitrogen 4 oxide for us to form nitric 5 acid. So scientists are actually telling us that chemical evolution theory is the only theory that can tell us more about the origin of life. And they're telling us that some time back, many years ago, millions of years ago, there was lightning, which still exists up to now. This lightning served as a catalyst. And in the process, it combined some elements to form some molecules. For example, they're actually telling us that hydrogen as an element, oxygen as an element, you see, carbon, nitrogen, underwent drastic reactions, underwent drastic combinations. And in the process, after undergoing the drastic combinations through the lightning as a catalyst, they formed several chemicals. And some of these chemicals included, number 1, ammonia, which is NH3. Of course, nitrogen and hydrogen must have combined. Then we have methane, which is CH4. This is an alkane and a subtopic called hydrocarbons, as far as the organic chemistry topic is concerned. Then we have water. It is as well taught in a topic called water and hydrogen in Form 1. I think the last topic in Form 1 called water and hydrogen. So that's H2O. So the formation of these molecules was as a result of these elements combining through the catalytic effect of lightning. Now, who knows even the truth of this information? There is a scientist called S.L. Miller. S.L. Miller was a scientist from America. He did his experiments in 1950s. And whatever he did was to actually pick some elements, like I've actually mentioned here. So he took some elements. Remember, we've said lightning acts as a catalyst by combining all these elements to form these molecules. Those molecules are going to give us now the origin of different life forms later on as we actually proceed with our discussions. But now, S.L. Miller wants to confirm the truth of this information, you see, from the scientific assumptions. So he takes an apparatus called the spark discharge apparatus. So the spark discharge apparatus, is the apparatus this S.L. Miller, as a scientist in 1950s, came up with. And in that apparatus, what did he do? He took elements such as hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, you see, and passed a spark through them. A spark. That spark was an equivalent to the lightning that served as a catalyst. So he takes these elements and places them in a spark discharge apparatus. In that apparatus, where he has placed those elements, he passes a spark through them, which is going to act as a catalyst. So the spark he has passed through these elements is going to serve as a catalyst so that he can catalyze these elements to combine quickly at a high speed so as to form molecules that we've actually just mentioned here, such as methane, the water vapor, or now the water, preferably in gaseous state, and the ammonia. That is what S.L. Miller did. He took a spark discharge apparatus, placed some elements inside the apparatus, and passed a spark through the elements to catalyze them, for them to combine and give these molecules I've actually mentioned here. Now, Miller proceeds and further passes a spark through these molecules and realizes that these molecules ended up giving the first 4 amino acids. I guess it will make sense to some extent from a scientific point of view. So he takes again these molecules within the same spark discharge apparatus and passes a catalyst or a spark through them. At the end of the day, he realizes that they can actually end up forming the first 4 amino acids. Remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins make up the structures of living organisms. They're the building foods. They build our body structures. Human beings are made up of proteins in their structures. That's why proteins are called the body-building foods. So he actually uses the molecules to form the first 4 amino acids. You know, he's trying to take us to a particular point of how we can be able to take it as the origin of life. So he says those molecules can form the first 4 amino acids. So those amino acids can actually be able to get that point of building our bodies. Remember, in biology, we have 20 amino acids. 20 amino acids. 20 amino acids. Those 20 amino acids are put into 2 main categories. You have what you call essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Non-essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Remember, essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids are the 2 main categories in which amino acids can get categorized. And of course, there are so many. We have what you call glutamine. We have what you call glutamic acid. Those are just examples of amino acids. Glutamic acid. We have what you call aspartic acid. We have what you call tryptophan. All these are examples. We have what you call the valine. We have what you call phenylalanine. All these are examples of amino acids. Remember, there are 20 in number. We have 10 essential and 10 non-essential. Those that can actually get synthesized in our bodies and those that can be able to get obtained from the diet we always take in every day. So whether they are essential or non-essential. So we have 10 essential amino acids and then 10 non-essential amino acids. Those that are actually able to get synthesized in the bodies and those that are able to get obtained from the diet we take. All of them, they're supposed to be 20. 10 essential, 10 non-essential. But now in as far as S.L. Miller's experiments are concerned, he could only make 4 of the amino acids. Very good. So let's proceed forward. So as he proceeded with his experiments, or from the results of his experiments, it can actually be able to get theorized, because it's a theory, that millions of years ago, elements like hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, in a primitive environment, ended up combining because of the lightning as a catalyst to form different molecules, such as water, ammonia, methane, and so many others. You see, and in that case, he actually added that further combinations of these compounds resulted in the formation of complex self-replicating molecules, resembling the DNA and the RNA. Look at that. So he says that now these molecules, like methane, look at this explanation, like methane, water, like ammonia, and even ethane, you see, further underwent combinations through the spark or through the lightning in the atmosphere to form self-replicating molecules. You see? Very good. So to form self-replicating molecules such as DNA, RNA, and others. So he says the molecules that had been formed previously underwent some further changes. And as they actually underwent some further changes and combinations, they ended up forming self-replicating molecules resembling. So these self-replicating molecules resembled the present day DNA, RNA, and other molecules within the structures of living organisms. And this DNA and this RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid, are the molecules that carry the genetic information in living organisms. So you can try to see how we are actually heading ourselves to the origin of life. So the molecules underwent further combinations through the catalytic effect to form self-replicating molecules resembling the present day DNA, RNA, and others that could carry now the genetic information that are required by living organisms. Now, they are telling us further that these molecules further underwent combinations through the catalytic effect to form simple organisms or life forms. And these simple life forms that we are actually able to discuss now are able to get associated with what you call viruses and bacteria. Look at that. The theory has come from far. Elements combining through the catalytic effect to form molecules. Molecules further combining to form self-replicating molecules like DNA and RNA. These molecules further undergoing combinations to give us the present-day viruses and bacteria. Look at that. So, chemical evolution supposes that chemical substances combine to form living organisms. I don't want to be very judgmental. Use your own understanding and the explanation I've actually given you to see whether this theory tries to make sense out of what you're trying to actually say here. So do you think chemicals must have been the origin of life, or was everything in the universe created, or do we believe in the folklore or the mythical stories that the traditions have actually displayed to us in terms of the origin of life? So in terms of this, we are going to actually give the assumptions of this theory. Which assumptions, which principles are able to get held accountable in as far as this theory is concerned? What can we actually say, or what can be our conclusion? Number one, we are saying life came into existence through combination of chemical substances. So life existed. Life came into existence through combination of chemicals. That's the first principle of chemical evolution theory. Life came into existence through combination of chemicals. Then the other concept or principle is that initial life forms were simple. Remember, we said under the creation theory that everything that was created by God was in its complex and perfect form. So it has remained unchanged over a long period of time. But in this case, you're saying, as far as the chemical evolution theory is concerned, initial life forms were simple and have changed over years. And have changed over years. Have changed over years to become complex. Have changed over years to become complex. Have changed over years to become complex. So they have changed over years to become complex. Have changed over years to become complex. Then, you see, in as far as this theory is concerned, scientific evidences can be given. Remember, I told you that the creation theory is not scientifically testable. You can't contradict that theory. It is actually based on faith and it cannot actually encounter any form of criticism. But in as far as the chemical evolution theory is concerned, we can be able to carry out scientific what? Experiments. We can be able to have what we call scientific evidences to back this theory. So scientific evidences in the form of experiments, scientific evidence in form of experiments, artifacts, and fossils. Scientific evidences in form of experiments, artifacts, and fossils can back this theory. So I may want to confirm this. And remember, S.L. Miller from United States of America as a scientist carried out this experiment. So he wanted to confirm the truth of this theory. And he came to realize that it was true. A catalytic effect on some elements could form different types of molecules and even lead to the formation of the life forms we have on our Earth's surface. So this theory is scientifically testable. It can give us some scientific evidences in terms of experiments like the one S.L. Miller did, artifacts or the remains, and then the fossils as well. So at the end of the day, it can get tested scientifically. It can be able to get tested. That's all about the chemical evolution theory. And remember, you might also want to know more about whatever is found in the universe. The theory still tells us more about this. It tells us that, number one, that the universe existed 15 billion years ago. Because I told you, we must know the origin of life forms and whatever is in the universe. So the universe existed. Universe existed on its own. Existed 15 billion years ago. Just look at that. Who knows the truth of this? It is more of what we call the theoretical aspect that we cannot be able to start questioning at this point. So the universe is believed to have existed around 15 billion years ago. And whatever followed the universe was the solar system. Solar system is believed to have existed 6 billion years ago. 6 billion years ago. Look at that. So we began by the universe 15 billion years ago. We have come back to the solar system. Of course, the solar system has to actually consist of the sun, of course, the heavenly bodies and the planets, you see. So the solar system came into existence around 15 less 9. That is actually 6 billion years ago. So, and the third thing to exist, in as far as this theory is concerned, is the Earth as a planet that supports 90% of the life forms we have. You see, so it is believed to have existed 4 billion years ago. 4 billion years ago. 4 billion years ago is when the Earth's surface ended up existing. And it is believed that it was actually able to exist, you see, because of a burned out star. You see, so there was a burned out star that left some tissue debris. The tissue debris left was the one that actually resulted into what we call the Earth's surface. Is it true? Is it true? Someone says that there was a burned out star 4 billion years ago, and whatever remained, or the debris from this burned out star, was whatever formed the Earth's surface. Of course, followed by some drastic cooling. You see, drastic cooling and reorganization. Could this be true? You find a burned out star, its debris forms the Earth after some cooling or drastic changes. So you see, at the end of the day, it is still clearly giving us a particular picture of how the Earth ended up getting formed. That there was a burned out star, the remains or the debris from that burned out star 4 billion years ago formed the Earth's surface. And drastically, for us to have a conducive environment for the survival of these organisms, like the plants and the animals and other organisms, it underwent some cooling and drastic reorganization in its crust, or the core of the Earth. So again, these people further go ahead and tell us that 1 billion years ago, which seems to be so historical, 1 billion years ago, the first single-celled organisms arose. You see, the first single-celled organisms arose. So 1 billion years ago, when the Earth's surface has actually formed, it is believed that prokaryotes are the bacteria. Why do you even call them prokaryotes? They have a nucleus which is not membrane bound. So a prokaryote or a prokaryotic organism is an organism like a bacteria. Remember, of all the 5 kingdoms, it's only the kingdom Monera, or also called the prokaryote kingdom, that has members whose nucleus is non-membrane bound. That means you have this as a bacterium, this is the nucleus does not have a membrane, so the membrane is actually absent. So that means you might have actually ended up coming across these structures of these living organisms like the bacteria. So 1 billion years ago, prokaryotes exist. Prokaryotes are the bacteria found under which kingdom? Kingdom Monera. If you look at their structure, the DNA or the nucleus is naked with no membrane around the nucleus within those organisms. So 4 billion years ago, a burnt out star leaves some debris. The debris form the Earth's surface, followed by drastic cooling and reorganization of the Earth's crust or the core. Later on, 1 billion years ago, what happens? You realize that prokaryotes or bacteria under kingdom Monera as unicellular organisms end up existing or emerging on the Earth's surface. So the first kingdom to exist must be kingdom Monera, which has bacteria, which are prokaryotes, with a non-membrane bound nucleus or a naked DNA. And with time, you realize that multicellular organisms also began emerging. So later on, multicellular organisms also began emerging. If I talk about multicellular, I'll be referring to plants, animals, members of kingdom Protoctista, and members of kingdom fungi. They also began emerging. And at the time, all life forms or various forms of life ended up emerging. So from simple life forms or low organisms to higher forms. And we'll be able to notice that from the description, evolutionary time is measured in millions of years. Millions of years. Millions of years. So we are dating back to the origin of life using billions of years. You see, and that makes sense actually. As far as history is concerned, and the chemical evidences given here, we can realize that life must have existed on the Earth's surface some billions and billions of years ago, beginning with the universe that existed 15 billion years ago, and up to the last point, 1 billion years ago, where we saw the prokaryotes or the bacteria now emerging on the Earth's surface, and followed by higher forms of life like plants and animals as well emerging. So that's all about that theory, and I want us to embark on now the evidences of evolution. What tells us that there were pre-existing simple life forms which underwent drastic changes to form complex life forms over a long period of time. So, evidences of evolution. Evidences of evolution. What shows that I have evolved? What shows that I was at one point a pre-existing simple life form, but now I am a complex life form as a result of evolution, as a result of undergoing drastic changes over a long period of time, gradually. So the first evidence of evolution is called fossil records. They can tell us that living organisms must have evolved. Number two, there's what we call geographical distribution. Geographical distribution. Number three, there's something called comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. There's what we call comparative embryology. Then you have what you call cell biology. Then we have what you call cell serology. So these are the main evidences of evolution. Concepts brought in place by scientists to show that life must have been previously simple, organisms must have previously seen to be simple, but over a long period of time and gradually they must have undergone some changes to become complex life forms. So we shall be able to explain these evidences of evolution one by one so that you can clearly be able to have a better picture of how life forms were initially simple but underwent drastic changes over a long period of time to become complex, underwent drastic changes to become complex. Now, and of course, when they were simple and became complex, whatever became perpetuated to the next generations was not the simple life forms, it was the complex life forms. So up to today, we can be able to have complex life forms existing. Why? The simple life forms underwent changes to form the complex life forms. The complex life forms were perpetuated or ended up undergoing what we call reproduction to transmit those forms, transmit those characteristics to the subsequent generations, so that the world ended up becoming a generation that actually consists of what we call complex life forms. In short, the variations arising in the subsequent populations eventually gave rise to different markedly seen organisms from parental forms. So these variations, when perpetuated in subsequent generations, led to the formation of new species. I was an organism with a simple life form. I was different from another organism. Both of us underwent drastic changes. We became new species or new organisms with different life forms, complex in nature. We drastically had reproduction in ourselves. We transferred or transmitted these new variations, these new life forms, these new changes, new characteristics to the next generation or subsequent generations through what we call reproduction. Now, let's begin with what we call fossil records as our first evidence of evolution. Fossil records. What are fossils? What are fossils? Fossils are just remains of ancestral forms that were accidentally preserved in some naturally occurring material. So fossils, remains or ancestral remains. are ancestral remains accidentally preserved. No, I'm using the word accidentally because the preservation of these remains that we're actually able to find right now were not able to get preserved in an intentional manner. It was all about an accidental process. So no one had intended that these remains were to actually get preserved. So you're saying they are remains of ancestral forms. The ancestors, you see, that were accidentally preserved in some naturally existing material. Any remains of the ancestors preserved accidentally in some naturally existing material can be referred to as what? Fossils. So accidentally preserved in some existing material, and of course they can get preserved in some naturally existing materials such as let's talk about sedimentary rocks and plant resins and amber. So you can be told to actually give some naturally occurring materials where remains were preserved accidentally. Ancestral remains were preserved accidentally. You can talk about sedimentary rocks, plant resins, R-E-S-I-N-S, plant resins. Then you have what you call the amber. Just some rock materials, you see. So fossils or fossil records is the first evidence of evolution. It tells us that organisms evolved and underwent changes to become complex from their previously simple forms. So in as far as fossil records are concerned, we are going to first define the term fossils or fossil. Fossils are just remains of the ancestors or ancestral remains accidentally preserved in some naturally existing material such as sedimentary rocks, plant resins, and amber. Such as sedimentary rocks, plant resins, and amber. So those are some of the naturally existing materials where these ancestral remains could get preserved. And we would want also to know what could be the study of fossils. So there's something called paleontology. Paleontology is the study of remains or fossil remains. You can just say the study of fossils. Study of fossils is called paleontology. The study of fossils is called paleontology. You might get told to define the term paleontology. It is the study of fossils. The study of fossils. So, how are fossils formed? Ways in which fossils are formed. Ways in which fossils are formed. How can we form fossils? Number one, it is good for us to note that fossils can be formed through one, petrification. Petrification is the first method that can help us to form fossils. Now, you see, you can find some plant and animal parts, all of them getting referred to as organic matter. All of them getting referred to as organic matter, getting converted to stones. Getting converted to stones. So that can be the first way in which fossils can be So in other words, stones can be fossils. How? Plant and animal parts, which can be called organic matter, get converted to stones through a process called petrification. And in that process, you can form fossils. So in other words, you take plant and animal material, you actually allow this plant and animal material getting referred as organic matter to get converted to stones. And in the process, you have actually formed fossils. And that process is called petrification. 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 Now, in other words, what are these parts of the plant and animals that can actually be able to get hardened or converted to stones? You can have some plant parts and some animal parts. Let me talk about the teeth from animals, the bones from animals, the shells from animals. Look at that. Then also the woody parts of plants. Woody parts of plants. So teeth, bones, shells, and woody parts of plants are plant and animal parts. Look at that. They get converted to stones and they'll actually form fossils. So these are plant and animal parts referred to as organic matter. They can get hardened, or they can get converted to stones. They can now form the fossil. They can now form the fossils. They can now be able to form the fossils. So that method is called petrification. You take plant and animal material like the teeth, the bones, the shells, and the woody parts of plants, called organic matter, then harden them, convert them to stones to form the fossils. So the first method of forming fossils is called petrification, hardening both plant and animal materials through a process called petrification. The second method that you can be able to actually use to form fossils, and as far as this part is concerned, there's something called preservation. So you can actually do what you call preservation of entire organism or its parts. You're going to preserve the entire organism or its parts. Till at the end of the day, you've actually ended up forming fossils. So one, petrification. You convert plant and animal parts to stones. Number two, you can preserve the entire organism or its parts in amber, some rocky parts. We have plant resins or plant remains, and even in ice, plant resins or even in ice. So someone can just pick the whole organism like a human being or the whole plant after falling, then that plant accidentally, because you have said fossils are able to get that point to be able to get called the remains of ancestors which have been able to get preserved accidentally. So I can take the whole organism or its parts and preserve it either in amber, plant resins, or even ice. So that way, if that whole organism or its parts get found in that resin of the plant or in that ice, then that can also be called a fossil. So this is the second method of forming fossils, preserving the entire organism or its parts in resin or ice. Now, the third method is that other fossils are seen as impressions such as casts and molds. So in some other cases, we don't need preserving the whole organism or parts of the organism. We don't need petrification, hardening, or converting of those plant parts or animal parts to stones. We just have to have some of these remains existing as impressions, such as casts and molds. So it's not even a long story. You just have some parts of the plants and some parts of the animals existing as impressions in the environment. In which form? Casts and molds. You see? And that way they can actually be able to end up being able to get referred to as fossils. And that can be the third way in which fossils can actually get formed. On to something else. Let's now look at the importance of fossils. So the importance of fossils. We want to look at the importance of fossils in as far as this area is concerned, and we shall actually be able to first say that when fossils are found in a particular environment, they always give us a particular evidence, a direct evidence of the type of animals and plants that existed at a particular or certain geological age. So, tell us more about plants and animals that existed at a particular geological age or period. That tells you more about the plants and animals that existed at a particular geological period. If I find a fossil or a remain or an ancestral form of a particular organism, such as a mosses or even a dog, that means a list of mosses and a dog can tell me more about what really existed at that particular period. If I find a fossil or a fern plant in a particular area, or I find a cow in a particular environment as a waste or a remain or a fossil, then that tells me that the mosses plants in this list or category and the dog, the fern plant, the cow, or the man existed at a particular environment at a particular geological period. So tell us more about or give us an evidence of the plants and animals that existed at a particular geological period. Number two, this also can confirm to us that different groups of organisms arose. You can also say came into existence. Came into existence at different times on Earth. Different groups of organisms arose or came into existence at different times on this planet called Earth. I would want to use this example to explain this. Which example do I want to use? I would actually be able to say that Kingdom Monera, for example, that has members referred to as bacteria, was the first one to exist or to arise on the Earth's surface. The second kingdom to follow on this or to follow suit was Kingdom Protoctista, also referred to as Kingdom Protista, that can actually have members such as Paramecium, Plasmodium, amoeba, we have spirogyra, we have euglena, we have chlamydomonas, trypanosome, and vorticella, or the seaweeds, or even the sargassum. All of them are actually able to fall under this kingdom, and they are the actual members that had the second arising on the earth surface. The third category to arise was that of kingdom fungi. The yeast, the bracket fungi, we have what we call the toadstool, we have the mushroom, the puffball, were the members of kingdom fungi that had the third arising on the earth's surface. The fourth category to arise was that of the plants, and lastly, the animals came last in as far as the order in which the organisms arose on the earth's surface is concerned. So the last category of organisms to arise on the earth's surface was that of the animals. Now, it can also be able to get associated with this to mean that sometimes you can look at the vertebrates, for example, and you realize that if researchers to get done, the oldest fossils are those of the fishes. So the fishes first existed, for example, as vertebrates, animals with a backbone. The second category was able to be that of the amphibians. Remember, the fishes follow this aspect of being able to appear as the first organisms on the Earth's surface. So they must be having the oldest fossils. Look at that. So in other words, if someone has to do research, like the archaeologists, and they find some bacteria in the Earth's surface together with members of kingdom Protoctista, like the Paramecium, they realize that the fossils of bacteria would seem to be the oldest than those of the Paramecium under kingdom Protoctista, to show that Monera has been able to get given as an example that had the earliest arising on the Earth's surface. If I compare plants and animals in terms of their fossils, I'll realize that the fossils of plants would be the oldest, followed by the fossils of animals. I mean, plants had an early rising on the Earth's surface, then followed by the animals. If I compare the fossils of fishes and amphibians, the fossils of fishes would seem to be the oldest, then later on the amphibians, to mean that the fishes had the earlier arising, followed by the amphibians. And progressively, we had the mammals being the last to arise on the Earth's surface. Now, that tells you that fossils can tell us more about the arising of organisms on the Earth's surface. Number three, you can actually use fossils to tell the phylogenetic relationship. You can tell more about phylogenetic relationship between organisms. Phylogenetic relationship between organisms. That means that I can be able to actually understand that organisms must have had a similar or common origin depending on the similarities between their fossils. Let me use this example. If I have to compare the fossils of a monkey and the fossils of man, I'll realize that the fossils of a monkey and those of a man must have a greater resemblance. Why? Because these organisms have a similar origin. They have a phylogenetic relationship. their phylogeny can get well discussed in terms of the way their fossils have a greater similarity. So a monkey and a man have a similar origin. They must have come from the same ancestral form because of the greater similarities between their fossils. And their ancestral form was referred to as proconsul. Look at that. So man and monkey have the same ancestral form called proconsul, to confirm to us that they have a similar origin in terms of their evolution. So fossils can tell us more about the relationship of the organisms in relation to their origin. Now, what could be the other advantage of fossils? What could be the other advantage of fossils? Fossils can tell us as well more about the increase in the complexity of the organisms. So, tell us more about the increase in the complexity of organisms. That means that if fossils have to get compared, you'd actually realize that there was evolution. Organisms were to actually evolve from simple life forms to complex life forms. For example, if I decide to look at the remains of Dryopithecus or Australopithecus, and I tend to compare with the remains of Homo habilis, for example, I move to maybe Homo erectus. Look at that. So Homo habilis, then I move to remains of Homo erectus, and lastly Homo sapiens. What comes into my mind? The remains of the Dryopithecus or the Australopithecus and the remains of Homo sapiens are not the same. A remain of Homo sapien would be more complex compared to the remains of a Dryopithecus. So this would actually give me a simple life form, but this would give me what you call a complex life form to confirm that there was evolution. So this would be the first evidence of evolution, that organisms had their previous remains being so simple, but now later on, due to evolution, their remains became more complex. So a relationship between a Homo sapiens and a Dryopithecus can be well explained in terms of the complexity. You get the point. So a Dryopithecus was one of the earliest forms of man, the simplest form of man. But after evolution, we had to actually end up becoming very complex in terms of our structures. To confirm that, we underwent evolution. Now, we can also be able to actually realize that because of this, if I actually have to dig out some of these remains, I'll realize that the younger rock strata in the Earth's surface would have fossils which are more complex. I repeat, the younger rock strata just at the topmost parts of the Earth's surface would have more complex fossils. But the older, look at that, the older rock strata just at the lower part of the Earth's surface would have simple fossils or simple forms of fossils. To confirm that, these would be now the most recent organisms occupying the younger rock strata because their fossils are more complex. This would represent the earliest forms, which are very simple. To confirm that, they are actually the earliest, the oldest, and these are the most recent. So the most recent complex forms of life occupy the younger rock strata in the Earth's surface. But the simple earliest life forms have to actually end up getting found in the older rock strata. You get the point? That is a confirmation that actually there has been evolution. There has been evolution. There has been evolution. So I would expect to find Dryopithecus just in the older rock strata, which is the simplest form of life or man. And I would find Homo sapiens in the younger rock strata, just at the topmost part of the Earth's surface. Very good. So we would also move to something else, which is going to be dating of fossils. Dating of fossils. Dating of fossils. So with the dating of fossils, we always use a method called radioactive dating. This is a method that is used to date fossils, to determine the age of fossils. Why do we use the radioactive dating as a method used to determine the age of fossils? How old would this Australopithecus be? N backdating. N determination of the age of a particular remain or ancestral form can get done using a method called radioactive dating. And in the recent dating, we have what you call radioactive carbon dating. Then, the general method is called radioactive dating. But now, a more advanced and definite method that we can actually explain in this manner is what we refer to as the radioactive carbon dating. Why do we then add carbon? Because at the end of the day, what we are going to determine is the age of fossils. And the fossils of what and what? Fossils of plants and animals. And these two organisms contain carbon. That's why the method is more advanced and can get called radioactive carbon dating. Why carbon dating? Because the remains of both plants and animals contain carbon. Remember, during photosynthesis, plants always use carbon dioxide to manufacture food. At the end of the day, they will actually contain carbon. The food they manufacture is in the simplest form referred to as glucose. For example, the chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6. In this molecule, there is carbon. So plants use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from animals to manufacture food. They use carbon dioxide. So their end product, as far as food getting manufactured by these organisms, will contain carbon. Now, remember, animals are heterotrophic, to mean they don't make their own food. They will rely on what plants has actually manufactured. So if a plant manufactures food, the food can actually get supplied to animals. So animals depend on plants in as far as their nutrition is concerned. So they're heterotrophic, but plants are autotrophic. If plants are autotrophic, they will make their own food. If animals are heterotrophic, they will depend on already manufactured food. So if they actually end up depending on plants as a source of food, they will be taking in carbon. We shall take glucose from plants, we shall take proteins, and many proteins also contain carbon. Look at that. So at the end of the day, plants do contain carbon because of the carbon dioxide they use to make their own food. Animals do contain carbon because of the carbon they obtain from the food they eat from plants. We know very well that the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Look at that. And of course, an amino acid must contain carbon. The longest carbon chain must be present in the structure of these compounds or these organisms. So radioactive carbon dating is used to determine the age of fossils of both plants and animals. We're saying carbon because both plants and animals contain carbon. Now, as we proceed forward, we should also capture this. The age of very old fossils. Age of very old fossils. Fossils getting dated millions and millions of years ago. Their age can get determined by using what we call the potassium argon method. So age of very old fossils is obtained by determining how old the fossils are by using the potassium argon method. Potassium argon method. So if I want just to determine the age of a recent fossil or not a very old fossil in the environment, maybe a plant that died or an animal that died some 100 years ago, I can use the radioactive carbon dating. Why carbon? Because both plants and animals contain carbon. Plants use carbon dioxide to make foods, they contain carbon, while animals feed on what the plants have actually manufactured, so they also contain carbon. So, very old fossils, fossils dated back millions of years ago, can get determined in terms of their age by using what we call the potassium argon method. Now, we want to actually ask ourselves, if you're using fossils to tell us or to actually confirm to ourselves that there must have been evolution, what would be the most possible limitations of using fossils as an evidence of evolution? Because at the end of the day, you realize that fossils have their own weaknesses. Fossils have their own weaknesses in as far as the evidence of evolution is concerned. Number one, there are limitations of using fossils. Limitations of using fossils. Limitations of using fossils to actually give us an evidence of evolution. Number one, you can talk about missing fossil records. Missing fossil records. These are majorly referred to as missing links. Missing fossil records or missing links. This means that some remains can get decomposed. Decomposed remains. You see, you are looking for a remain of a Homo habilis, but accidentally, that remain in the Earth's surface has completely been decomposed. That link is missing. I cannot be able to actually understand the transition of the process of evolution, maybe from a Drypithecus to a Homo erectus. Why? Because I know I may have Homo habilis here, then there's a missing link here. Why? A Homo erectus might have been decomposed completely. Then I'm actually going to what we call the Homo sapiens. So, some fossils are missing. If these fossils miss, can I understand the process of evolution? Can I know where I have to actually move to when I move from the Homo habilis? No. Why? Because the Homo erectus is missing. Homo erectus is missing, but Homo habilis is present. Homo sapiens is present. So that means missing fossil records, missing links because of the remains getting decomposed can actually make us to find it so difficult to understand the transition in terms of the evolution or the changes in the complexity of the structures of organisms when they're actually undergoing evolution. So some forces are really missing, some forces cannot be able to get traced because maybe they might have actually been decomposed. Or sometimes the remains might have been scavenged on. The predators might have eaten the remains. At the end of the day, the missing links can actually exist. When missing links exist, then that means it will be difficult for you to understand the process of evolution. Like understanding that this organism evolved from this stage to this stage, then from this stage to this stage, then lastly from this stage to this stage. If one link misses, if some fossil remains miss, you cannot get a better picture, a clear picture of how this organism underwent evolution from one stage to another. Or sometimes some remains may have failed to fossilize. That means there were no appropriate conditions for civilization. You can say there were no appropriate conditions for fossilization. No appropriate conditions for fossilization. No appropriate conditions for fossilization. So, what are some of the disadvantages or limitations of using fossil records to show that there's evolution? One, we've said some fossils can be missing, which we can always be able to refer to as missing links. So fossils are missing, or we are what we call missing links. So if fossils are missing, or what we call missing links, then that means those fossils might have either one been decomposed and are completely broken down by bacteria and fungi, or some of these fossils may have been scavenged on or eaten by predators, or some of these fossils may have lacked appropriate conditions for forming or fossilization. At the end of the day, if those fossils miss, we can understand the process of evolution from one stage to another because of the missing fossil records. The second disadvantage is distortion of parts of remains, distortion of parts of remains during sedimentation, distortion of parts of remains during sedimentation. This was a structure of maybe a cat, you see, just as a remain in the earth's surface. Then some parts get distorted. Look at that. So maybe the limbs end up missing, or the hind gets to that point of missing, or there are no ears. So if some parts of this animal get distorted as a remain, what happens? We cannot get a clear picture of evolution because majorly we are looking at the structures of the organism to understand the aspect of evolution. If the Homo habilis was walking maybe on fours, and the Homo sapiens ends up walking on twos, and accidentally I realized that the remains of Homo habilis and the remains of Homo sapiens have no limbs. Would I understand the process of evolution? No, because I'm basically going to look at the structures. So if some of these structures are distorted, if some parts of the remains are distorted because of this sedimentation process, you see, you'll end up not having a clear impression or picture of how evolution has actually occurred or how the structures have become complex from their initial simple forms. So some parts can get distorted during sedimentation, making us to have a wrong impression of the structures. Now, next, we have what we call distortion. Distortion of fossils by geological or geographical activities. Distortion of fossils by geological or geographical activities. Some of these geographical activities can be maybe faulting, we are folding, we have earthquakes. Those can be some of the, or just uplifting, or the mass movements within our Earth's surface. So all these can actually be able to distort the fossils. Once fossils are distorted, we cannot have a clear picture of the structures of the organisms and be able to do what you call a comparison to determine whether there must have been evolution as far as these organisms are concerned. Very good. So I would want just to give some history of how organisms evolved in terms of the human beings. And it is believed, in as far as Charles Darwin's research or writings are concerned, that the earliest being was referred to as proconsul. Remember, this data has been captured in his books. In one of the books you can be able to actually look at is what you call the Descent of Man. So in the book The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin proposes that human beings, Homo sapiens, descended from ape-like structures. In his book The Descent of Man, he says that man, the reason man now, the Homo sapiens, descended from ape-like structures. And we've been actually looking for evidence for this to support this theory, so that at the end of the day we can be able to have a clear picture of how man evolved. So in the book Descent of Man, written by Charles Darwin, he says that the recent human being, now the man, the Homo sapiens, came or originated from the ape-like structures that have actually to get captured here in my next discussion. So he says the earliest ancestor was referred to as proconsul. Proconsul underwent changes to give us one hominidae and pongidae. And the pongidae gave rise to chimpanzee. The pongidae gave rise to chimpanzee. Information. Then also the monkey. Then the orangutan. But now, fortunately, the hominidae gave rise to man. In other words, man and monkey must have had the same origin. They came from the same ancestral form. So monkey, chimpanzee, and orangutan are under an ape-like structure called the pongidae. Man under an ape-like structure called hominidae. They all come from the same ancestral form called proconsul. Very good. And you also need to understand that from this aspect, you can actually have this discussion. You'll realize that some of the earliest forms of ape-like structures that man had actually arise from were like the Australopithecus. I've mentioned about that. Australopithecus. That is something very, very important for you to note. We can also be able to talk about Sahelopithecus or Sahelanthropus. We have Homo habilis. We have Homo erectus. We have Homo sapiens. We have the modern man. So Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. They are what you call the modern man. So these are some of the ways in which you can be able to actually explain this. In other words, at the end of the day, we've looked at how the proconsul gave rise to hominidae and pongidae. Hominidae gave rise to the modern man, who must have come from the ape-like structures like Australopithecus, Sahelanthropus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and now there is a man. The pongidae, as the other ape-like structure, ended up giving rise to the monkey, the chimpanzee, and the orangutan. So all these are actually able to come from the same ancestral form. So they must have some sort of what you call resemblance. Okay, so we would want actually to look at some structural differences between modern man and the ape-like creatures that must have had an earlier existence. So if the ape is put here, and we actually put here the modern man or the human. Moving forward, let's have a look at something different, and I want us to get to the differences between the apes and what we have as the modern man. So what could possibly be the differences between the apes and modern man? And we will always be able to have this. We have the apes and the modern man. Now the human beings we have in our environment, and we shall actually be able to say that the ape has a cranium enlarged, and this modern man has a cranium greatly enlarged. So the ape's cranium is enlarged, but the ape's cranium, in terms of its enlargement, is slightly lower than the enlargement of the cranium of the modern man. So the cranium of the modern man is greatly enlarged. And of course, the cranium is just the skull, the bony part of the head region that protects the delicate brain and other structures within the neck and the head region. So the second difference is this: brain capacity is 500 centimeters cubic. So brain capacity or brain size, you can say brain capacity or brain size. And here, the brain capacity stroke size is 1,350 centimeters cubic. So this ape has a low learning capacity. Why? The cranium is not so enlarged, the brain size is smaller, and of course now there's low learning capacity in relation to the brain size. There's a high intellectual capacity for the modern man. This can get well seen in the way man is making inventions, discoveries, and trying to use the knowledge at his or her disposal to be able to come up with different ideas that can help the world or the environment. The ape has a large incisor and canine. A large incisor and canine used for defense and, of course, killing prey. So the incisor, abbreviated as I in biology, in as far as the rendition of an animal is concerned, and canine, abbreviated as C, in the dentition of an animal, or an animal like a human being, we can actually have them being larger, and they are too large or bigger so that they can be able to actually pierce through the flesh of the enemy. So for defense, then they can also kill the prey. You know, there's what we call predation. Predation is a feeding relationship where one animal, the predator, kills and feeds on another animal. The one that gets killed and as well gets fed on is referred to as the prey. So the large incisor and canine of the apes could well get used for defense and killing the prey. Now, here, the incisor and canine are very much reduced. Are very much reduced. Very much reduced. Not suitable for defense and killing the prey. Not suitable for defense and killing the prey. Larger incisor and canine, or large incisor and canine, used for defense and killing the prey. Reduced incisors and canines, not suitable for defense and killing the prey. The pelvis for the ape is narrow and elongated. The pelvis is narrow and elongated. But here, the pelvis is broad and as well flattened. The pelvis is broad and flattened. So the hind, the buttocks, to be very specific. You know, if you look at the vertebral column of animals, now the vertebrates, you'll be told that there are 7 bones from the base of the brain to the thoracic cavity. That is to tell you that the first vertebral part of the vertebral column is referred to as the cervical vertebra. The second one is called thoracic vertebra. The third one is called lumbar vertebra. We have what we call the sacral or sacrum. We have what we call the coccyx. You see, or coccygeal. You get the point. So those have to move from the cervical vertebra, from the brain, to the coccyx or coccygeal at the bottom, just at the posterior end of our body. So at the pelvis, at the back of your body, you see, just the behind that you have as a human being, the modern man, is actually flattened and broad so that your sitting apparatus can be able to withstand any pressure of your upper part of the body when you're sitting on a chair, for example. But now that of a monkey is much narrow and elongated, much reduced and elongated. Look at that. So that means the apes that must have existed some years ago must have had a narrow and elongated pelvis, you see, just within your buttock region or your behind. But now that of a modern man is broad and flattened. Flattened to increase the surface area to accommodate the weight of the body when someone is seated, for example, on a chair, and as well be able to support the weight of the body. Now, something else. You'll realize that the pelvis had a quadrupedal locomotion. Quadrupedal locomotion. The layman's language, that means walking on 4. Walking on 4. That means using both the forelimbs and the hind limbs during the walking process. So here the locomotion was bipedal. Bipedal locomotion. Bipedal locomotion, or walking on two. Walking on two. Bipedal locomotion. Bipedal locomotion. So look at that. Bipedal locomotion. So pelvis is narrow and elongated. Pelvis is broad and flattened. Quadrupedal locomotion or walking on four. Then bipedal locomotion or walking on two. So another difference you can talk about forelimbs. The forelimbs of the ape. Forelimbs of the ape. That is forelimbs of the ape used for arboreal locomotion. Arboreal locomotion, of course, means maybe jumping from one branch to another, just like the way the monkeys move from one tree branch to another. So arboreal locomotion, and of course walking. So you can find a monkey that may use as an ape walking on four and using the forelimbs for walking. But if found on a tree, these monkeys can jump from one tree branch to another using their forelimbs, and as well being able to hold tightly on the branches using their forelimbs. So they can use their forelimbs for arboreal locomotion, enabling their movement from one tree branch to another. Forelimbs of the apes were used for arboreal locomotion from one tree branch to another, and as well walking on the ground on a flat surface. And of course, they had what you call an opposable thumb. Opposable thumb could help them to get well held on the branch. Opposable thumb, look at that. So they could actually use these limbs to get hold of the branch and use this opposable thumb to tightly hold onto that branch. You see, so this is the branch. They well get held on the branch and use this opposable thumb to strongly hold the branch. So they had an opposable thumb on the forelimbs. Now, forelimbs here, forelimbs are used for manipulation of objects. Manipulation means I can get hold of my calculator. I can open it and be able to begin using it. So I'm using my forelimbs, the hands, to manipulate objects. See, I can use this to open this thing. So modern man uses forelimbs for manipulating objects. For example, modern man can use forelimbs to make tools. So at the end of the day, they still have what you call an opposable thumb. They have an opposable thumb. Have an opposable thumb. So they have an opposable thumb. So opposable thumb. So that can actually give us a good number of differences between the apes and man. And of course, hind foot for this. Hind foot has opposable toe. That is for the ape. Hind foot has opposable toe for grasping tree branches. And this has non-opposable toe on the hind limbs. Our hind limbs do not have any opposable toe. Our hind limbs do not have an opposable toe. Now the modern man. But now if you look at a monkey, especially the hind limbs have an opposable toe. not finger again, we're talking about the hind limbs, which can seemingly be able to get used as legs for walking by man, the modern man. So the hind limbs of a monkey have an opposable toe so that it can well grasp the branches. But now the hind limbs of man, the modern man, has no opposable toe. But these hind limbs, now the legs, are mainly used for stability on the ground. And they can actually enable this modern man to walk from one place to another or to actually locomote. So hind limbs in man are used for stability on the ground and be able to move from one place to another. Now that is all about fossil records as an evidence of evolution. And maybe I would want to go to the second evidence of evolution so that you can be able to really dissect this area and understand how man underwent changes to confirm to us that there was actually evolution. We have what we call geographical distribution. Geographical distribution of organisms. What I would say is this. There's a theory called the continental drift theory that can give us a better explanation. So, geographically, there was distribution of organisms. And the way the organisms became distributed geographically, it can tell us more about how organisms had a similar origin in the first place to begin with. But because of the distribution, these organisms must have undergone some drastic changes. These organisms must have undergone evolution. These organisms must have undergone some structural changes to end up becoming adapted differently to the different climatic conditions in the different areas they had actually destined to after getting distributed. So what this continental drift theory says is this. There was initially a large, single landmass. A large single landmass. Then, this large single landmass underwent drifting. On undergoing drifting, it ended up forming the 7 known continents. So there was a large single landmass that got created. Because of the continental drift theory, the large single landmass underwent breaking up. So it broke up into parts. The parts, after breaking up from each other, drifted from one another, forming the present day continents. We have South America, we have North America, we have the European part of the world, we have what we call the Asia, the Australia, Africa. So those are just examples of the continents we have in our environment. So if you look at these continents, you realize that they must have first initially formed a single large landmass. But because of the continental drift theory, it actually tells us that or supposes that these continents were formed because the large single landmass broke up, the parts drifted away from each other, forming those continents. So this continental drift theory isolated the organisms of a common ancestry. For example, if I had the koala bear here, the koala bear and man on the same single large landmass, then the koala bear, due to the continental drift theory separating the parts of this large single landmass, traveled or became distributed or isolated to Australia. and ending up becoming a poached mammal, I would end up having man drifting, for example, to Africa to become a placental mammal. So the continental drift theory made it possible for the organisms to become distributed geographically, even if the whole world had organisms with a common ancestry. So those organisms, as they migrated, they evolved along different evolutionary lines. We had a similar origin on the single large landmass. The large landmass has drifted or separated. On separating, the organisms are geographically distributed to the different parts that get formed after the large landmass drifts or separates or breaks up into several parts. On evolving along those different evolutionary lines, it resulted in the formation of new different species, because if we were all mammals here and we migrate due to the drifting and we become distributed to the different continents, we shall evolve along those different evolutionary lines. At the end of the day, what happens? We shall end up resulting into new species, distinct from those found initially in the climatically similar but separate regions. For example, if I decide to actually pick an example of Australia and Africa, these two different parts of the initially single large landmass must have had some similarities. They must have been organisms with a particular similarity. But because of the drifting or the separation, this must have ended up making the organisms to move into those two different continents that must have different climatic conditions. At the end of the day, they end up having different characteristics, or they actually evolve into new species. Now, you might find some continents having similar climatic conditions, but their flora and fauna, their animals and plants must be different. For example, monkeys with long prehensile tails inhabit the Amazon forest in South America. So if I decide to actually pick this as my continent, then I talk about the 7 continents. I might say this is South America. And then I can call this Africa, I can call this Australia, I can call this maybe North America, then I can maybe use this as South America. Let's pick this. So if I decide to use North America, Australia, South America, and Africa as just examples of continents, not bothering so much about their position, we will realize that monkeys with long prehensile tails inhabit the Amazon forest in South America. Monkeys with long prehensile tails occupy the Amazon forest in South America. But now, look at this. The short-tailed monkeys inhabit the African forests. These monkeys were all having the same origin. They must have been on the same single large landmass. But because of the drifting of the parts of the large landmass to form the present-day continents, those monkeys must have ended up evolving along different evolutionary lines. So they end up finding themselves in different climatic conditions. At the end of the day, they must have evolved to form different organisms or species of the same organisms, like the long prehensile tailed monkeys in the Amazon forest in South America and the short-tailed monkeys in Africa. Now, another example, the panthers and jaguars, found in which category? The class cat, are actually found in the Amazon forest in South America. But now, the cat family that you have as leopards and cheetahs are found in Asia. Look at that. So we have panthers and jaguars in the Amazon forest that represent the cat family. We have leopards and cheetahs. Look at that. In Africa. And go to Asia, you'll find the tigers. You see? So it is all about having a particular cat family initially occupying the same single large landmass. It consists of panthers, jaguars, leopards, cheetahs, and tigers. Because of the drifting away of the parts of the single large landmass, The panthers and jaguars have to actually end up getting only found in South America, in the Amazon forest. They are the new species that must have evolved from the cat family during the drifting along that evolutionary line. The leopards and cheetahs found themselves as new species of the cat family in Africa after evolution. The tigers are now found in Asia. From the cat family, because of evolution, they actually underwent changes to become now the cat family representatives now in Asia. Now let's go to this other example. The llamas are found in the Amazon forest as an example of a camel family. We have the modern camels found in Africa. Look at that. So the llamas of the Amazon forest and the modern camels found in Africa and Asia are thought to have had a common ancestry in North America. Look at that. So the llamas and modern camels originated from North America. But because of the drifting, those organisms became geographically distributed. And in the process, they actually underwent evolution. They evolved along those evolutionary lines. At the end of the day, they occupied Asia, Africa, and Amazon forest in South America as areas with different climatic conditions. Because of that, the evolution they underwent made them to become different organisms. Look at that. Now, so the organisms, because of the drifting, became distributed, became isolated, and evolved into different species. Look at that. They became isolated, they became changed, they evolved along those different evolutionary lines, and because of the different climatic conditions in those areas, the organisms ended up becoming different. They evolved into different organisms. So they're not the actual monkeys we had in North America, because you're talking about the llamas in Amazon forest and the modern camels that you know in Africa and Asia. They were the same organisms in North America, but because of evolution, because of the drifting of the continents, they actually underwent evolution and became different organisms. Now, look at Australia as a continent. It is thought to have been the first continent to drift away from the initial single large landmass. Look at that. It is actually believed that when the Australia drifted away from the initial single large landmass, placental mammals had not actually been formed. Look at that. So this continent ended up having its own peculiar fauna or group of animals. Some of the animals or the mammals found in Australia, in the absence of placental mammals, which were not formed when the drifting had actually begun, are like the kangaroos, the koala bears, and the spiny anteaters. So kangaroos, koala bears, and the spiny anteaters are examples of what you call poached mammals or marsupials. They lack a true placenta. Look at that. Kangaroos, koala bears, and spiny anteaters are the poached mammals or the marsupials. They lack a true placenta, like the way the placenta has to actually get so much discussed in terms of the survival of what you call the fetus. So a human being has a true placenta, so is referred to as a placental mammal. But now, in Australia, the many examples of mammals you may actually want to give are the kangaroos, the koala bears, and the spiny anteaters. They are actually lacking a true placenta. They are referred to as poached mammals or marsupials. They have a pouch where they can keep their young one, and the young one grows and actually develops to become an adult. Another example of mammals found in Australia is the egg-laying category. Egg-laying mammals or monotremes, such as the dark-billed platypus or echidna, are also found or are very indigenous in Australia. That tells you that, with an exception of human beings, that it is very, very rare for you to find placental mammals, mammals with a true placenta in Australia. Why? Because Australia was the first continent to drift away from the single large landmass before any placental mammals had been formed on that single large landmass. So in drifting away, it only drifted away with one, the marsupials or the poached mammals and the egg-laying mammals, ending up lacking what you call the placental mammals or mammals with a true placenta. So the drifting away of these continents ended up making organisms to actually evolve along those lines in relation to the climatic conditions of these areas, making each and every continent to have a particular or a peculiar fauna and flora in terms of the animals and plants. Now, you see, as the continents were drifting away from each other, they end up becoming separated by one, deserts, oceans, and mountains. And at the end of the day, this seemingly gave rise to a variety of animal and plant types. Because the types of plants to be found in the desert may not be the same plants you may found on a normal terrestrial piece of land. You see, that's what we call the mesophytes, the hydrophytes, the halophytes, and the xerophytes, like the acacia. So the drifting away from the continents from the single land mass ended up making these continents to become separated by different physical features, such as the oceans, dry deserts, and mountains. And this as well gave rise to different groups of plants and animals, and as far as evolution is concerned. And of course, that's a very nice way of explaining that. And you may also want to actually get more about how evolution occurred, and most importantly, you'd actually want to go to maybe something else so that you can just be able to get a better understanding of this. And what I would want us to actually look at is what you call comparative anatomy. That's the third evidence of evolution. Comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. So that is the third evidence of evolution. The third evidence of evolution. Comparative anatomy has well been able to actually maximize on the use of what we call form and structure of different organisms. We look at the structural appearance of the organism. You see, some organisms show basic structural similarities. For example, if I look at a human being and I look at a monkey, these two organisms can show some basic structural similarities. Their body structures can be similar. So if the body structures or the morphology of these organisms is similar, then that can actually trace back into what we call a similar ancestral origin or a common or related ancestry. But where anatomy or morphology is totally different or distanced, then that means they have what we call less evolutionary relationship. Look at that. Look at this. Assuming we have this as a human being and this as a monkey, and they show similar structural features, what does that tell you? They must have a similar or a common ancestry. But if the structures are different or not so much related, then that means those organisms have a different origin or a less evolutionary relationship. That means they must have had a less chance of having been able to evolve from a common ancestral form. So that tells you man and monkeys must have had a similar evolutionary relationship or a common or so related evolutionary relationship. Now, you can find sometimes types of evolution getting discussed here. We have what we call divergent evolution. That means that one basic structural form is getting modified to give rise to various different forms. So we call this divergent. Diverge. Look at that. 1, 2, 3. One basic structural form, like the limb, which can be the forelimb, the hind limb, the wings, maybe in some animals that are actually able to fly, getting modified. one basic structural form, one structure of an organism, or one structure of organisms getting modified to give rise to various different forms. To give rise to various different forms. Now, when this one basic structure or one basic structural form gets modified to give rise to various forms, then that means at the end of the day that this structure will have to form these forms or these different types of structures now in different organisms, and these structures can actually get adapted to a particular ecological environment or niche. So one basic structure or one basic structural form getting modified to form or to actually end up getting that point of forming different structures. These structures can get adapted to different ecological niche in a particular habitat, and this is called adaptive radiation. What is adaptive radiation? Where the different forms formed from one basic structure getting adapted, you see, to different ecological niche or niches in different habitats. Now, what are some of these structures? For example, we have what you call homologous structures. Homologous structures. These homologous structures must have had a common embryonic origin, but they are now modified to perform different functions. For example, you might have this as homologous structure. The structure is able to give us different forms. So this can be the first form, the second form, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and then the sixth. So all these ones are able to get called homologous structures. Why? Homologous structures, I've told you that you can have one basic structural form getting modified. You get the point? As it gets modified, it can form different forms. Those forms can get well adapted to a particular ecological niche or habitat. So adaptive radiation means the different forms resulting from one basic structural form becoming well adapted to a particular or a different ecological niche from the previous form. So if you come here, this can be homologous structures. To mean they must have a similar embryonic or a common embryonic origin, but they have now been modified to perform different functions. So the initial basic structural form underwent modification or underwent evolution to form different basic structural forms. Those forms have actually been adapted to perform different functions. So the structures become homologous structures as long as they have a similar origin and they are now modified to perform different functions. Now look at the forelimb. The forelimb in different vertebrates. You'll realize that the forelimb in the different vertebrates has what we call the basic pentadactyl. Basic pentadactyl. Basic pentadactyl. Basic pentadactyl, or you can also be able to call it the 5-digit. Basic pentadactyl or the 5-digit structure. You see, 1, 2, so you can maybe draw here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The basic pentadactyl. 5 digits. The basic pentadactyl or 5-digit structure getting retained. But now, what happens? You'll realize that the functioning is different. For example, if you look at the forelimb of a bat as a mammal, it is actually modified for flying. Look at the forelimb of a human being for grasping. Look at the forelimb of a whale. It is modified into a swimming flipper. And that of even a turtle, the same purpose can actually get captured. If you look at the forelimb of a bird, it's actually modified into a wing for flying. The forelimb of a mole as a mammal, modified for digging. A forelimb of a zebra is elongated and well modified for fast running. So all these forelimbs of all these mammals must have had a common origin with the same basic pentadactyl or 5-digit structure. But because of evolution, because of getting separated into different continents, the structures became more modified. And at the end of the day, they began performing different functions. So such structures are called homologous structures. Homo, similar. That means the structures had the same embryonic origin. They had the same 5-digit or basic pentadactyl structure. But because of undergoing evolution, what happened later? They became modified to perform different functions in these organisms. So the forelimb of a bat modified to form a wing for flight, while that of a horse is elongated to enhance speed in running. The whale or a turtle is modified to have a swimming flipper in as far as its forelimb is concerned. Now, uh, the basic pentadactyl form is modified to perform a particular locomotory function, like flying, swimming, walking, and running. Locomotory to mean complete change in position by an organism. Now, another example of an adaptive radiation is that of the beak structures of birds. Beaks of birds. And you realize that beaks in birds have a common embryonic origin in terms of the basic structure. And of course, they're just beaks. You can have the hen, the chicken, the dove, the eagle. The basic structure seems to be similar. That confirms that the beak or the beaks of birds must have actually had a common embryonic origin with a basic structure. But depending on the type of food and mode of feeding, what happens? This basic structure has become modified, has undergone evolution, has undergone some drastic changes. You get the point? To suit a particular mode of feeding or the type of food getting eaten by these birds. So the beaks have actually been modified in terms of length, shape, and size. For example, the short stout, you can actually capture this. The short stout beaks are common in the seed eaters we have, like the chicken, while the nectar feeders have long, slender beaks to allow their long, slender beaks to find their way into the flowers. Look at that. They can have a slender or smaller in size and long beak so that they can actually find their way into the inner parts of the flower to obtain the nectar. You can also have fruit eaters having relatively large beaks, you see, to actually break or actually separate the parts, you see, or get rid of what you call pericarp of the fruits, you see, so that they can actually have a better meal as far as the fruits are concerned. So the fruit eaters have relatively large beaks so that they can actually be able to have the fruits getting well eaten. Carnivorous birds like the eagles have strong hooked beaks. The strong hooked beaks are able to actually tear the flesh and get hold of the flesh well during the feeding process. So we're just trying to give examples that can actually confirm to us that some structures might have had a common embryonic origin, but because of the evolution, what might have actually happened? These structures might have undergone some changes so that the organisms can actually be able to perform a particular function relating to the habitat, where they're staying, the mode of feeding, and other features to actually get discussed as far as this part is concerned. So we've talked about the forelimbs in mammals, we've talked about the beaks in birds. The beaks in birds. So the beaks in birds can also be able to get captured as far as the way these structures are concerned. Without forgetting this, we'll also be able to actually talk about the foot structure in birds. Just look at the foot structure in birds. The same structure. The same as well pentadactyl structure. But now again, the pentadactyl structure in different birds has undergone modification, evolution, or changes, so that each and every foot becomes modified to perform a particular function. For example, you'll actually look at the ducks. They wade in mud. So their webbed feet are able to actually enable them to even swim and wade in mud. If you look at the heavy feet of the eagles, now the carnivorous, they're actually able to grasp and tear the flesh because of their heavy feet. You see? So the heavy feet of eagles, which are actually hooked, can actually get hold of the flesh and tear the flesh as well. So those are just examples of the structures we can be able to actually use in as far as this discussion is concerned. So you might actually want to get more about these structures. Please feel free to be able to have an access to them and be able to see how it goes about. So we can actually be able to actually move to another type of structure. We have structures called analogous structures. So there are those that have different, remember homo means same. So homologous structures have a similar origin, but they are now modified to perform different functions. And in this case, analogous structures are those that have different embryonic origin, but they are now evolved to perform similar functions. Different embryonic origin, but now are able to actually get modified to perform a similar function. With homologous structures, they had the same origin, but now modified to perform different functions. Here, analogous structures, they have what we call different embryonic origin, but now modified to perform a singular or a similar function. So an example, it is actually believed that the wings of insects and the wings of a bat, the mammal, have different embryonic origins. But because of exploiting the same kind of environment, such structures have finally ended up becoming similar in terms of the function they perform. For example, both birds and insects have wings for flight. Recently now, as we say, or as we speak. But the wings of birds have the pentadactyl limb structure, the 5-digit limb structure, while the insect wings are supported by toughened veins, which are composed of cuticle, which originate from the exoskeleton. Remember, we said that in insects, there is a polysaccharide called chitin that actually covers their body, or that actually makes up the exoskeleton of these animals. So if you look at a bird, like a dove, or any bird that flies around, you realize that the forelimb is actually modified into a wing-like structure for attachment of flight muscles. And at the end of the day, this forelimb has still a pentadactyl limb structure, or the 5-digit structure, just modified with a wing-like appearance to allow these birds to fly around. If you look at insects, they are actually able to have wings. The wings are just supported by toughened veins that contain cuticle. And these wings, supported by toughened veins, originate from the exoskeleton. Look at that. At the end of the day, regardless of the differences in the structures, all these structures have been modified because of exploiting the same environment to become useful during flying. Now, look at the eyes of vertebrates. The eyes of vertebrates. I'm a vertebrate. I'm a mammal. I have a backbone. the eyes of vertebrates and those of mollusks, such as the octopus, are also examples of analogous structures. If you look at the structures, they have different embryonic origin. Their structures are literally different, but they have actually been modified to end up performing a similar function in the environment. So analogous structures must have different embryonic origin, but they become modified to perform a similar function. The wings of a bird with a pentadactyl structure are modified to support flying. The wings of an insect with toughened veins, composed of cuticle and originating from the exoskeleton of these insects, like the grasshopper, are also able to end up flying or supporting flying because of the way they have been modified. The eyes of vertebrates like mammals and amphibians and reptiles and the fish and even the birds, and those of the mollusks like the octopus, are able to perform a similar function, although they are different in terms of their structures or their appearance. So apart from homologous and analogous structures, we have other structures called vestigial structures. We've talked about homologous. We've talked about analogous. So we have homologous, analogous structures. We have got what we call vestigial structures. So these are structures that have, in the course of time, after a long period of time, ceased to be functional and therefore have become reduced in size or are rudimentary. It was just a large-sized structure initially, but over a long period of time, or in the course of time, has become 1. Functionless, 2. Reduced in size, and at the end of the day has become rudimentary. With no any signs of growth. Examples. Look at the appendix in man or human beings. It does not perform any digestive function. While in herbivores, like the cows, the goats, and the sheep, you see, it is well developed and functions as the part that breaks down cellulose, as far as the alimentary canal of these animals is concerned. I've said the appendix in man has no any function in terms of digestion. It is closely attached to the large intestine. It does not perform any digestive function. But if you go to herbivores, those that feed on vegetation, the appendix breaks down cellulose because these organisms feed on vegetation, and vegetation forms part of what we call kingdom plantae, and plants have cells and the cells have cell wall. The cell wall is made up of cellulose. So then that means the cellulose making up the cell walls of these plant materials or plant cells must be broken down by the appendix during digestion. So the appendix breaks down the cellulose. Number 2, we have what you call the python and the whale have no any externally visible limbs. And people still believe that the python as a snake and the whale as a mammal found in the water, as an aquatic mammal, are believed to have had hind limbs. But the hind limbs must have actually ended up reducing in size and actually become rudimentary or functionless. What shows that these organisms must have had hind limbs is because of the pelvic girdle that is still visible. So the pelvic girdle, still visible in these animals, traces back to the presence of hind limbs some time back. Look at the kiwi as a flightless bird of the New Zealand and some other parts of Africa. Has reduced wings beneath the body plumage. It means that this bird under class Fs must have had wings for flying, but the wings must have ended up getting reduced in size over a longer period of time. And after getting reduced in size, the wings became rudimentary. They are still able to actually become visible beneath the body plumage, and they can actually be visible to confirm that they must have actually been larger and functional some time back, but because of evolution or undergoing changes, the wings must have, in the due course, reduced in size, become rudimentary, and now ended up becoming functionless. Look at the vestigial tail in the present human beings. That vestigial tail, we are actually taken to be organisms or animals that must have had a longer tail. But because of evolution, the tail must have reduced in size and become rudimentary or functionless. So that vestigial tail that is much reduced in size is called coccyx. It's called coccyx. Now, look at mammals. Mammals have a nictitating membrane on their eye surfaces. It is reduced and does not perform any function. But if you look at birds and fish, it can move over the eye and act as the third eyelid. So a membrane called the nictitating membrane can move on the surface of the eyes of birds and fish to act as the third eyelid. But now the problem is, in man or mammals, that nictitating membrane has reduced in size and is now functionless. So all these examples of vestigial structures point to the fact that the organisms where the structures are functional and the organisms where the structures are vestigial must have had a common origin. Yeah, that's true. I am a man. I have a reduced nictitating membrane. Someone else or another organism is a bird or a fish, having a nictitating membrane running over the surface of the eye. If we all have nictitating membranes, then that means we must have had a common ancestral what? Origin. But because of evolution, these structures in our bodies underwent drastic changes. And on undergoing these drastic changes, then that means in some the structures became reduced and became functionless or rudimentary, but in some the structures persisted and now can perform different functions. Look at the appendix in man. Look at the appendix in herbivores. We must have had the same origin because we have the same structures, but because of evolution, these structures have undergone changes in such a way that in man it is now functionless, reduced in size, or rudimentary. But in the herbivores, the structures are still functional, digesting or breaking down cellulose. That's all about comparative anatomy as an evidence of evolution. Another evidence is what you call cell biology. Cell biology. This is another evidence of evolution. Cell biology is another evidence of evolution. So if you look at cell biology, you'll realize that it literally means that you are looking at the organisms, and in that case, you'll first look at their cells. So the cells of all animals show basic similarities in their structure and function. You looked at the cell in Form 1, you are told that there's what you call a plant cell and an animal cell. And what did we say? The cells of both plants and animals contain the cell membranes, and other organelles such as ribosomes, Golgi bodies, mitochondria. We have what you call the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So if both plants and animals have similar organelles, what is an organelle? A structure within a cell. Then that means the plants and animals must have had a similar embryonic origin. But because of evolution, we might get some differences between the two cells or the organisms. So one, if cells have the same organelles, like the mitochondrion, the Golgi bodies, the ribosomes, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the cell membranes, then that means they must have had a similar embryonic origin. Now, just to move forward, we have also some biological chemicals, or very important chemicals in both plants and animals. One, we have what we call the adenosine diphosphate, ADP, or adenosine triphosphate, ATP. These are the chemicals that store energy that gets produced in the mitochondrion when food gets broken down chemically in the presence of oxygen during respiration. So ADP and ATP and even DNM, deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNM, ribonucleic acid, all these chemicals are found both in plant cells and animal cells to also tell us that these organisms must have had a similar embryonic origin. Now, or the organisms must have had what we call a common ancestral origin. Now, apart from the similarities displayed in both plants and animal cells, we can also be able to actually look at the differences in the structures and chemical substances in their cells. For example, a plant cell contains cellulose cell wall. You can find a cell wall in an animal cell. So plant cells contain cell walls made of cellulose as a polysaccharide. A cell sap, plants contain a cell sap is a mixture of salt, sugar, and water in the vacuole of plant cells. Remember, a plant cell's vacuole is large and centrally located. But in an animal cell, vacuoles may be absent, but if they are present, they are small structures scattered within the cell of the animal. So, I can find an animal cell, a cell wall. I can find a cell sap, a solution within the vacuole of the plant cell. I can find a chloroplast. I can find starch. You get the point? I can find chlorophyll, the green coloring matter. But all these things are not found in animal cells. To confirm that, even if plants and animals had a similar origin, there must have been evolution. Both plants and animals must have undergone some drastic changes to end up becoming different and having different structures as well. Now, among animals, you can also talk about the blood pigments, the components of blood. For example, we are told that hemoglobin is found in all vertebrates and some invertebrates. Hemoglobin, the red pigment that gives blood its red appearance, the one that combines with oxygen to transport the oxygen around the body, and as well combines with carbon dioxide to transport carbon dioxide from respiring cells to lungs for exhalation. So hemoglobin as a red pigment found in blood is found in vertebrates and in some invertebrates. There's another chemical called hemocyanin. Hemocyanin is also a blood pigment that is widely distributed in both vertebrates and as well invertebrates. But in most cases, it is found in many mollusks, such as the octopus, and some crustaceans, such as the crab, the shrimp, the woodlice, the crayfish, the daphnia. Those are examples of crustaceans that have a blood pigment called hemocyanin. If you go to a phylum called phylum Annelida that has earthworms, you'll find that the chemical present in these members of this phylum is called chlorocruorin. Chlorocruorin. So I've talked about hemoglobin found in vertebrates and invertebrates. Vertebrates such as mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and others. Invertebrates such as the insects and the arachnids. Then if you come to the hemocyanin, it is found in mollusks like the octopus. Then also in crustaceans such as the daphnia, the woodlice, and the crabs and the shrimps. If you talk about chlorocruorin, it is found in members of phylum Annelida, like the earthworms. So, because these organisms have different blood pigment, then that means, yes, they must have had a common or similar embryonic origin. But because of evolution, they must have ended up undergoing some changes to end up becoming different in terms of their blood pigments. So, the presence of the blood pigments or the presence of the blood as a transport fluid confirms that they must have had a common embryonic origin. But ending up having different blood pigments in the transport fluid confirms that there must have been evolution. Very good. So the differences occurring in both plants and animals indicate that from the common ancestral stock, plants and animals became separated, and at the end of the day, evolved along different lines of evolution. So that's all about cell biology. That's all about cell biology. And we shall also be able to talk about another evidence of evolution. We can talk about comparative embryology. Comparative embryology. So comparative embryology states that you are studying the formation and development of an embryo. Embryology. What is embryology? The study of the formation and development of an embryo. An embryo is a young one of an organism. I remember I was told by my biology teacher that when the male nucleus fuses with the female nucleus, we always form what we call a zygote. The zygote undergoes what we call mitotic cell division. After undergoing mitotic cell division, the zygote forms what we call a mass of cells called morula. The first cell divisions occurring so that you can form a mass of cells called morula is called cleavages. So cleavages is the first cell divisions that occur. When cleavages as first cell divisions occur, they form a mass of cells called morula. This mass of cells can actually travel along the oviduct until they are actually taken to the uterus. Once this mass of cells, forming now the zygote, end up getting implanted in the endometrium or the myometrium wall of the uterus, then that means you're going to have what you call an embryo. So you can only form an embryo when the zygote becomes implanted in the lining of the uterus or in the wall of the uterus. Okay, so the embryos of different animals, like the vertebrates, for example, have been found to have similar morphological or outward appearance features during the early stages of development. Just try to look at the embryos of different vertebrates, like the embryo of a man, the embryo of a dog, the embryo of a cow, the embryo of a lion, the embryo of a zebra, the embryo of a donkey. The embryos or the young ones of this, even the embryo of the chicken, for example, the embryos of these animals have a similar embryonic origin. Why? Morphologically, they are very similar. They have what we call similar morphological features during their early stages of development. In fact, it might be very difficult for differentiate between an embryo of a man and an embryo of a donkey. They are very similar, very similar. That means that if the embryos of these animals are similar, then they must have what we call a similar or a common ancestry. So the closer the resemblance between the embryos in the early stages of development, the closer the phylogenetic relationship in the organisms or of the organisms. So if I compare the embryos of different organisms and realize that they have similar morphological features, they are closer in resemblance, that means they have a common ancestral form, they have a common ancestral origin, they have a similar or closer phylogenetic relationship. Now, this can be defined or explained by what you call recapitulation theory. Let me just explain this. It can be defined by what you call recapitulation theory. Recapitulation theory. With recapitulation theory, you will actually understand that the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny. I was told this by my biology teacher. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This means that the stages that an embryo will undergo to form an adult resemble the successive stages in the evolution of the ancestral forms. Let's give this example. This is an embryo undergoing changes to form an adult, for example. So these stages that the embryo undergoes to move from this embryonic stage to this adulthood stage resemble the stages of evolution of the ancestral forms. That's what the recapitulation theory states, of the ancestral forms. So an embryo moves from this embryonic stage to another stage, to another stage, to another stage, until it forms an adult. Those stages resemble the stages of evolution of the ancestral forms. To confirm that, we must have actually had some similarities in terms of the origin of man and whatever has to actually get discussed in terms of evolution. So if my embryonic stage moves to other stages until I form an adult form of the same organism, and those stages are similar to the stages of evolution of the animal, then that means that we must have evolved. We must have undergone some drastic changes. You see? That confirms that we must have undergone some drastic changes in as far as evolution is concerned. We must have undergone some drastic changes in as far as evolution is concerned. So this tells you that if an embryo moves to a particular stage called stage 1, then to another stage 2, to another stage 3, to another stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, stage 6, then that means that those stages are showing how man also evolved from the ancestral ape-like forms to the modern man. And that can actually confirm to us that there must have been evolution, to be precise. If the stages you are actually experiencing right now, in terms of the development of the embryo to the adult form, resemble the stages of what you call the evolution of the ancestral forms to the modern man, that tells us, confirms that there must have been evolution. 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 So those are the main ways in which you can be able to actually confirm that there was evolution in as far as this topic is concerned. There must have been evolution. Organisms must have evolved. Organisms must have evolved. And there can be a possibility that someone can ask you to also explain evolution in man by using what you call cell serology. Cell serology. So that can also be an evidence of evolution. So we'll actually be able to just give a brief description of how it works, or comparative serology. So that you can be able to understand how it works. So what happens? We have blood, and blood is a very important component of the human body. It helps in one, transporting nutrients and oxygen to different parts of the body, so that each and every cell has an access to oxygen and nutrients for the metabolic purposes. The same blood has to transport wastes such as carbon dioxide and urea as an heterogeneous waste from their site of excretion to where they're supposed to be eliminated from the body of an organism. So blood has blood proteins, and such blood proteins can be albumin, fibrinogen, prothrombin, thrombin, heparin, and others. These blood proteins are able to give us more information about evolution. For example, always remember that antigens and antibodies are mostly discussed as far as evolution is concerned in relation to the proteins found in the blood. We said we have what we call the rhesus factors, antigens and antibodies. We have antigens capital A and capital B to actually give us more information about the blood groups. So it can either be blood group A having an antigen A in capital, or blood group B having capital B as your antigen, or blood group AB having capital A and capital B as your blood group, and as well blood group O with no antigen. Antibodies are written in lowercase, like small letter a, small letter b, and antibodies. So, for example, those organisms or species that have a stronger and common phylogenetic relationship, or those organisms that are phylogenetically related, contain more similar blood proteins. For example, if I'm a man and you are a dog, and we actually have what we call analysis of our blood, and the scientist realizes that the blood proteins in my blood and the blood proteins in your blood as a dog are more in terms of similarity, then that means we have actually ended up confirming that we had a similar ancestral origin. So, similar blood proteins in blood samples of two different organisms tell us that the organisms must have a common ancestral origin, or they are phylogenetically related. Now, experiments are also carried out using what we call a serum. So, experiments with serum are called serological tests. Experiments with serum are also called serological tests. They are actually used to show that relationships exist between different organisms. For example, if the human serum is injected into a rabbit, remember, the human serum has both antibodies and antigens. It is getting injected into the body of a rabbit. The rabbit's immune system has antibodies. What happens? The rabbit's immune system produces antibodies to counteract the effect of the antigens in the blood of the human being. In the process, an immunological reaction can occur. Look at that. So the rabbit produces antibodies against the human proteins. When the blood with antibodies is drawn from the rabbit and mixed with the serum from different animals, there must also be an immunological reaction occurring to form a precipitate. So I take my blood, I inject into the body of the rabbit. My blood has blood proteins like antigens. The antigens are able to get seen as invaders or foreign substances. The immune system of the rabbit responds by producing another type of proteins called antibodies. The antibodies fight the antigens from the blood of the human being. An immunological response occurs, a precipitate is formed. Now, if we take blood from the rabbit's body and inject into the bodies of different animals, immunological responses are going to occur to form precipitates. And the amount of precipitate formed varies from one animal to another. And for example, the greater the amount of the precipitate, the closer the relationship between the animal and the human being. I'm assuming I extract blood from my body as a human being, I put in different beakers. Then I extract blood as well from different animals, then add to the blood I've put in the different beakers from this human being. I would expect to find a precipitate forming because of the immunological response, a reaction between the antigens and the antibodies. Now, the reaction between these antibodies and the serum from these animals, such as a chimpanzee, produces a lot of precipitate, showing a close relationship. But now there's what you call a reaction with a distant organism like a dog showing no precipitate, to mean that a dog and a human being are distantly related. They do not have any closer phylogenetic relationship. They might not have had a common ancestral origin. But now a chimpanzee and a monkey with a human being can actually end up having the two blood components from these different animals forming a large amount of precipitate to show a closer phylogenetic relationship or a closer ancestral origin. But any blood from a human being and that of a dog in a particular beaker may not form any precipitate to form a conclusive statement that these animals are distantly related. These animals are distantly related. Just almost to the end of our topic, I want us to look at some of the differences between the four limbs of these two animals. You have a bat and as well a mole. A similarity they have is this: all these two animals are mammals. To be specific, they have mammary glands that they can actually be able to confirm to us that they are able to feed their young ones on milk through a process called breastfeeding. And you see, if you look at their forelimbs, for example, you'll realize that the forelimbs of a mole and that of a bat are slightly different, and that's why they are adapted to perform their functions differently. For example, these animals' forelimbs have elongated phalanges and with long claws. Elongated phalanges with long claws. But the mole's forelimbs have short, stout phalanges. Elongated and long phalanges. Elongated and long phalanges. Short and stout phalanges. That brings out the difference between the phalanges of these two animals. So one has elongated phalanges, but the other one has short, stout phalanges. So the bat's forelimbs have elongated phalanges with the long claws, while that of a mole have short, stout phalanges. Now, the bat's forelimbs will be able to spread out skin so that this can form a wing for flight. But those of a mole, because they are short and stout, they are able to dig out or to dig up food from soil. So dig up food from soil. Dig up food from soil. So I can look at a mole and have short, stout phalanges, which are able to dig up food from the soil. I can look at the bat's forelimbs and realize they have elongated phalanges with the long claws so that they can well spread out to form a wing. So I saw it better for us to just look at some of those differences so that we can be able to move to something else. And I'd want us now to embark on something different. I want us to look at the mechanism of evolution. The mechanism of evolution. Mechanism of evolution. So with the mechanism of evolution, we are going to use two theories to actually have a better understanding of how evolution must have occurred, or to show how evolution actually occurs in real life situations. For example, in our syllabus, and more information to actually help us understand this area very well, we've been given Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck's theory. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory. And this theory came into work in 1809. We have this other scientist, this other archaeologist, and a philanthropist that loved his country so much, called Charles Darwin, that also came up with a theory that has well much helped us in as far as evolution is concerned. So, we have two theories to actually help us understand how evolution occurs, or to actually help us reinforce this aspect of how organisms evolve. So if we begin with Lamarck's theory, we'll realize that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed several hypotheses regarding the mechanism of evolution. One of the hypotheses he actually came up with was, when the environment demands the need or use of a particular structure in an organism, the organism now develops the structure in response to the environmental demand. For example, if a giraffe has to have its neck well getting demanded in the environment, the giraffe will develop that structure, the neck, in response to the demand that the environment has towards that organism. If an environment demands that the organism uses its forelimbs for fast running, then that organism or those organisms will develop their forelimbs so that they can be able to fulfill what the environment demands. So because the organisms end up developing the structure in response to the environmental demand, then this will lead to the natural use. Okay, the organism will naturally use that structure because the environment demands the need for that structure. So there will be either natural use or disuse of the structures. And because the organism naturally uses or disuses the structure, it will lead to changes in the individual during its lifetime. Let me begin from here. I am an organism, for example. I am in a particular environment. Then that environment demands that a particular structure on my body gets needed. I'll develop that structure in relation to the demand of the environment. And in that process, I'll naturally either use that structure or disuse that structure. And in the process of using the structure or disusing the structure, certain changes will get produced in me as an individual during my lifetime as I will be living on this earth. Now, Lamarck proposes that the structures or these changes to the structures that the organism acquires during its lifetime will be transmitted to its offspring and subsequent generations. And in the process, there will be a rising of or emergence of new forms or new species. I began from here. We are in a particular environment as organisms. That environment demands that we develop certain structures in our bodies. Our bodies will respond by developing those structures in relation to the demand of the environment. In the process, the organisms will either use or disuse their structures to fulfill the demands of the environment. And in the process of using or disusing, the structures will actually undergo changes in the organisms during their lifetime. Lamarck goes on and says that these changes are going to actually get transferred or transmitted to the offspring of these organisms and further to the subsequent generations of these organisms. And in the process, because the changes have been transmitted to these offsprings or the subsequent generations, then at the end of the day, those offsprings with these new changes from their parents will actually become new forms or new species. Look at that. Then, of course, if I'm a parent and the environment demanded that I develop a strong hand, what happens? I will either use this hand or disuse this hand to develop that change that the environment demands from me. And this acquired change or this produced change in this individual's lifetime will actually be able to get transmitted to the offspring during its lifetime and its subsequent generations. In the process, these are going to be new forms or new species compared to the parent. These forms that emerge with the new changes acquired from the parents will have certain advantages over their ancestral forms in the exploitation of this ecological environment. Because I developed a structure, I underwent some changes, I produced some changes in my structures because of using or disusing the structures I have. I have transmitted those changes to the offspring and subsequent generations. Then at the end of the day, I'm going to actually understand that these new forms or these new species having these new characteristics or features will be able to have certain advantages over their ancestral or parental forms in exploiting this environment. Now, he cites an example of the present day long-necked giraffe from the short-necked ancestral forms. He says that the short-necked giraffes constantly stretch their necks to reach vegetation in the higher levels to avoid competition for food with other browsers, like the zebras and the antelopes. So, this person says that the short-necked giraffes were ancestral forms or parental forms. These short-necked giraffes, which were the ancestral forms or parental forms, began stretching their necks to actually reach the vegetation in the higher levels of the trees or plants. And at the end of the day, they were actually avoiding competition from other browsers in that environment. So at the end of the day, the longer neck that developed in these ancestral forms of the giraffes became successively transmitted or passed on to the next generation. So the next generation, now the offspring and the generations to actually get talked about here, had an advantage over the short-necked ancestral forms. Eventually, the long-necked species, the present-day giraffe now, was able to get formed. Obviously, the short-necked giraffes lacked food because of the long-necked giraffes being able to have an access to the vegetation in the higher plants, making them to actually die or actually migrate. They became extinct. Another example could be this. Lamarck's theory is the actual appearance of the flightless birds, such as the ostrich, the emu, the kiwi. You see, we are actually told that the ostrich, emu, and kiwi initially used to fly. They had normal wings for flying, but they disused their wings. They used their wings for flying in the areas that never demanded flying. At the end of the day, because they used their wings to fly in the areas that never demanded flying, then that means they disused their wings. And in the process, the wings became reduced in size. On becoming reduced in size, now the wings of the ancestral forms, that characteristic became transmitted to their offspring or subsequent generations. In the process, we have the present day flightless, kiwi, emu, and ostrich. You see, people have criticized Lamarck's theory because if I am working in a construction site or I am weightlifting, I'll become more masculine. I'll develop muscles. The development of the muscles or the ability of I becoming more masculine becomes more phenotypic. It is going to actually affect my phenotype and not my genetic makeup or genotype. So the idea that whatever we actually acquire as a characteristic because of using or disusing our body structures is not actually correct. Because there's no way in which I can actually weightlift, I can actually work in a construction site, develop muscles, then those characteristics or that muscular aspect becomes transmitted to my offspring or my subsequent generations. Because I would have actually affected my phenotype, my outward appearance, and not my genotype or genetic makeup. So, It is the explanation that acquired characteristics are inherited that makes this theory very unacceptable. It becomes unacceptable to actually tell us that the acquired features or characteristics mainly affecting the phenotype or the outward appearance can become transmitted to the subsequent generations, because none of our phenotype can get to that point of getting related to what we call the inheritance of characteristics. What we transmit to our offspring or to our subsequent generations is found in the genotype, in our genetic makeup, in our DNA, and not what you can see from outside in terms of our phenotype or overall characteristics. So, phenotypically acquired characteristics which do not affect the genotype of an organism or an individual cannot be inherited. Phenotypically acquired characteristics which do not affect the genotype of an individual cannot be inherited. So that's all about Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck's theory that actually came into use in 1809. Let's turn to something else, and we're going to look at Darwin's theory of natural selection. I told you that Charles Darwin came up with his theory in 1859. He actually wrote a book called The Origin of Species. You see, another one called The Descent of Man during evolution. So his books, The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, have actually captured very crucial information concerning evolution. So Darwin proposed an explanation for the mechanism of evolution in contrast to Lamarck's theory. And Darwin put forward his explanation based on a concept called natural selection. That is to tell you that there was a way in which a particular feature you had could make you to get selected against by the environment or selected for by the environment. If that feature could make you to get adapted to the environment, you could get selected for. If whatever you had as a feature could not make you to get selected for, you could now get selected against, and you could not survive in that environment. You could either migrate, die, or get actually extinct. So some of the hypotheses that this guy put in place, or features he actually placed in place in terms of his theory on what we call natural selection, from his book The Origin of Species 1859, proposed that 1. Variations occur within members of a population. Variations occur within members of a population. Variations occur within members of a population. I repeat, variations occur within members of a population. You see, you can have normal parents, for example, but these parents are normal in terms of height. They're all tall. But a dwarf individual just arises from this population. So a variation, a difference, maybe between the offspring and the parents, can arise within a particular population of related individuals. And these variations arise by chance and from within the individual. You see, I cannot actually understand as to why, for example, biologically, if all parents are phenotypically tall, then you expect 90% to a greater extent to have an offspring which is also phenotypically taller, because this offspring is going to acquire the genetic information in terms of height from the parents. So if they are all tall, we expect the offspring to also be tall. But if we find a population of individuals who are tall, and accidentally we end up having a dwarf individual arising from this population, that's a variation that has actually arisen from this population by chance. Now, the second proposition to capture this. This person says that through sexual reproduction, these characteristics are transmitted to the successive offspring. I have a population of tall individuals. Then accidentally, by chance, variation occurs where an offspring which is dwarf arises. This characteristic of dwarfism in this individual will get transmitted to the next generation or offspring. That dwarfism can either become advantageous to the individual or disadvantageous to the individual. Something else to note. He says that, just Darwin, the number of offspring will always outweigh the parental generation. We can have many offspring. For example, you can have two parents. See, giving birth to 10 children. Look at that. So the number of offspring will outweigh the number of the parents, or the number of offspring will outweigh the parental generation. But only a few of these offspring will survive to adulthood, and they can also be able to end up reproducing as well. Now, why do we end up having few parents or a smaller parental generation, giving rise to a larger number of offspring, such that the number of offspring outweigh the number of the parental generation? It's because the environment has pressures. Some of these pressures are like predation, we have diseases, we have competition for food, and as well breeding sites. Even organisms compete for breeding sites. So if we have predators, a predator is an animal that can actually kill and feed on another organism. So if we have predators, the predators will actually feed on this offspring, reducing their numbers. If we have diseases, the diseases can attack this offspring and kill some of them that may not survive. If there's competition, there might be a competition between the offspring or between the offspring and their parental generation. Some of these offspring may not survive to adulthood. They'll actually end up getting killed. There'll be competition for breeding sites. At the end of the day, some of the offspring will end up dying. So at the end of the day, even if the offspring number is greater than that of the parental generation, only few of these offspring can actually mature to adulthood because of the pressures from the environment. So at the end of the day, members of the same species are in constant competition for them to survive. They have actually to end up competing adequately so that they can end up surviving. So they're actually looking for an effort to survive. And this concept is referred to as struggle for existence. The resources are limited, the offspring are many in number, so they are competing to survive. They have to actually struggle and have an effort to survive. So they have what you call struggle for existence because of the limited resources in their environment. So in the struggle for the existence, those offspring with advantageous characteristics will become well adapted to the environment because they'll be well suited to the environment. So if this has a long neck, for example, as a giraffe, and this has a short neck as a giraffe, the long-necked giraffe has an advantage over the short-necked giraffe. It will survive. So as they'll be struggling for existence, the long-necked giraffe becomes advantaged. You see? And then the short-necked giraffe becomes disadvantaged. So, at the end of the day, the long-necked giraffe is selected for to survive in the environment. The short-necked giraffe is selected against by that environment. So it does not well get suited to the environment, but the long-necked giraffe becomes well suited to the environment. So the long-necked giraffe will get selected, survive, and reproduce. Those that are poorly adapted, like the short-necked giraffe, will actually end up perishing, and they won't transmit their characteristics to the next generation. Look at that. So long-necked giraffes will survive. They will actually become well adapted to the environment. They'll be able to actually struggle and exist. They'll have an effort to struggle and exist. They'll survive. At the end of the day, what happens? They'll be able to reproduce and give rise to new offspring with those new characteristics. So that aspect of this long-necked giraffe surviving is actually refers to as survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. So the most fittest organism is the long-necked giraffe. The short-necked giraffe does not survive. So there's what you call survival of the fittest in this case. So which one survives? The long-necked giraffe. So struggle for existence and survival of the fittest are sometimes misunderstood. But what does this actually mean to us? Environmental pressures can be on the population. We have competition, we have diseases, we have predation, competition for breeding size, competition for resources. All these are environmental pressures. They can have a greater impact on the population. And only those members with advantageous variation will survive and this will make them to survive. For example, a colored individual does not struggle to exist the predators. Why? Its color can well camouflage. It thus escapes predation. According to this person called Darwin, natural selection means just a chance or a probability or a chance of occurrence. So it's just by chance that a certain individual or species is suited to a particular environment, and while the other species or individual is not well suited to the environment. So the one that becomes well suited can escape the environmental pressures. It will survive, and after all, it will end up transmitting its characteristics to the next generation. The one that does not well get suited will actually end up migrating, dying, or becoming extinct. It won't survive. So it ends up dying. Natural selection is a mechanism with beneficial variations. Look at that. So natural selection, the nature selects the most suited organism. And that most suited organism can actually be able to end up surviving. So that characteristic can get transmitted. So the characteristics which are actually more advantageous, the characteristics that can make the organism to become well suited, can actually get perpetuated to the next generation. The disadvantageous variations, on the other hand, will get eliminated. So those individuals with beneficial characteristics or beneficial variations are better well adapted to compete for resources within their environment. So they will survive, reproduce, and transmit these variations to their next generation. Those with disadvantageous variations are less well adapted. Hence, they are not able to compete favorably. Why? They don't have the appropriate features or qualities to actually make them survive. So at the end of the day, they become eliminated. Now, remember, it's all about few generations or smaller features or characteristics getting transmitted to the next generation. The accumulation of these smaller variations or differences or characteristics getting transmitted to the next generation will end up resulting into the emergence of new species. Imagine I had a short neck, I developed a long neck, I transmitted that to the next generation. That next generation developed a particular feature also, then transmitted that extra feature to the next generation it had. That other generation developed a feature as well. So the resultant generations are actually accumulating few generations characteristics. Those new generations, those resultant generations, those subsequent generations will be accumulating few characteristics, smaller characteristics, smaller features, smaller variations. And at the end of the day, the next generations won't be the same as the ancestral forms. So that's what you're saying, there will be emergence of new species. Now, you see, sometimes the changes you are talking about here, like I had a short neck, I developed a long neck. I transmitted that to the next generation. It has been traced back to what you call a mutation. It is believed that mutations occur randomly within our genetic makeup. So organisms that carry beneficial mutations can be able to pass them to their next generation through reproduction. So sexual reproduction is particularly significant since it can actually allow the transmission of characteristics to the next generation. Remember, meiosis leads to the formation of gametes, like the male gametes and the female gametes. So meiosis is a process, a type of cell division that occurs in the testes of the male and in the ovary of the female. Through oogenesis, the formation of the eggs, and spermatogenesis, the formation of the sperm cells, we can form gametes, the male gametes and the female gametes. When the male and the female recombine through what we call fertilization, they're actually bringing together different variations or characteristics into this new generation or offspring. So these mutations are going to be transmitted to many generations. And at the end of the day, we shall have an emergence of new species in the subsequent generations, different from the parental forms. And you see, sometimes the emergence of these new species requires a very longer period of time. It's not something that can actually take a single day or even a week. So the emergence of these new generations, these new species or offspring will require a longer period of time, because the rate of mutations that a particular species undergoes requires a very long period of time. Now, experiments have actually confirmed that mutations can either be harmful or beneficial. Whether harmful or beneficial, they will result in the change of the structure of the offspring. See, where the organs and appendages and the structures of these organisms can end up becoming changed because of the transmitted mutations through what you call recombination of the male and female gametes, through what you call fertilization. So I think that's all about Charles Darwin's theory in as far as these concepts are concerned. That's all about Charles Darwin's theorem in as far as this information is concerned. Now, you'd want to have a practical explanation of evolution. You'll be told that in the 18th century, before Britain underwent industrialization, the lichens as plants in that country were actually able to have a better camouflaging property of the white speckled peppered moth. Look at that. In the 18th century, before industrialization in Britain, the tree trunks of the lichens could well camouflage, could well be able to actually protect, could well be able to actually make the white speckled peppered moth to actually not get eaten by the predators, like the bats. So the dark melanic peppered moth were well seen by the predators. They became eaten. At the end of the day, they could not be able to transmit their characteristics to the next generations. So the surviving white speckled peppered moth on the tree trunks of these lichens could now be able to actually reproduce and transmit their white speckled characteristic to their next generations. So at the end of the day, we had an emergence of the white speckled peppered moth. You see, so the white speckled peppered moth before industrialization was selected for by the environment. Then the dark melanic peppered moth was selected against. So they became extinct, or they actually died out. After industrialization, the smoke or the soot from the industries covered the tree trunks of lichens. The dark melanic form of this peppered moth became well camouflaged. The white speckled peppered moth could not be able to get camouflaged. They were eaten by the predators. So the white speckled peppered moth, after industrialization and the covering of smoke and soot on the tree trunks of lichens, became selected against, and then the dark melanic forms were selected for by the environment. They survived. They were perpetuated. They actually ended up transmitting their characteristics to the next generations. They survived. So it tells us that the dark forms were better protected in the industrial area against predation from birds than the lighter forms. In the smoke and soot pollution areas, there was a greater frequency of the melanic form, while in the soot-free areas, the speckled white moths predominated or were greater in numbers. Thus, the agent of natural selection was selective predation on the unprotected forms. Natural selection tells us that the organisms can either get selected against or selected for. In this country called Britain, when industrialization had actually taken toll on this country, the smoke and the soot polluted the air or the environment. It covered the tree trunks of lichens. In those areas, the dark or the melanic forms were well protected. They never got eaten. At the end of the day, they became selected for. they survived. They predominated in those areas. In the areas where there was no industrialization, the leeches were never covered by smoke and soot. The white speckled forms were well protected. They predominated. They increased in numbers. They were larger in numbers. The dark melanic forms were actually predated and they actually never got selected for. They became selected against. And you see, the occurrence of the melanic form could have been due to a mutation. You see, because the white speckled peppered moth might have undergone some changes or mutation in the genetic makeup of these organisms, in the DNA of these organisms. That change or that variation or that mutation might end up getting transmitted to subsequent generations. You see, to form what we call the dark melanic form. Now, you see, this is just a possible transition towards what we call speciation. And that means that there are varieties representing what you call the same species. The dark melanic form and the white speckled form are the varieties representing this peppered moth. These forms are called polymorphic forms. Polymorphic forms. Polymorphic forms. The polymorphic forms are just the forms that a particular species can exist. The variety that can actually form the backbone of these organisms. For example, the peppered moth can either be white speckled or dark melanic. For example, if you look at what we call the sickle cell trait, that has maybe one of the chains of the hemoglobin, one of the chains of the polypeptide hemoglobin, having glutamic acid getting replaced by valine, can also be a good example of what we call natural selection in action. Now, it's known that there's a high frequency of this mutant gene in places where malaria incidence is high. Those people with sickle cell trait can better survive malarial attacks. You see, so if you have a mutant gene or a mutant gene responsible for sickle cell trait, you can better survive malaria. So in areas that have a higher incidence of malaria, you'll find a greater number of people with the sickle cell trait. Why? Because they can survive the malaria. Look at that incidence or scenario. So areas with high cases or greater outbreak of malaria can better have a greater number of sickle cell trait individuals because they can survive the attacks. And of course, in those areas, you'll have organisms with normal hemoglobin getting selected against because they'll actually get eliminated by malarial attacks. You see, so individuals with sickle cell trait in areas prone or with areas with a greater outbreak of malaria will get selected for. Those with normal hemoglobin will get selected against. That's what we call natural selection in action. And at the end of the day, those who are heterozygous, that is to actually give you this concept, HbA, HbS. Of course, Hb stands for hemoglobin. So this is a carrier of sickle cell anemia. So he has what we call a sickle cell trait condition. He is heterozygous. That means the alleles are not actually similar. HbA, HbS. That individual can better survive malaria. See? So heterozygous individuals with a sickle cell trait can better survive malarial attacks than their individual counterparts. So heterozygous individuals are selected for, while normal individuals with the normal hemoglobin are actually going to be selected against. And of course, in this case, you're going to realize that drugs, antibiotics, and pesticides are chemical substances that you can be able to use to kill disease-causing microorganisms like bacteria, some pests, either field pests or storage pests, and some other chemicals that can actually get used to prey on crops and maybe animals to kill the pests. You see, sometimes these antibiotics and pesticides are rarely 100% effective for your information. Why? Because some pathogens and pests usually survive and reproduce. They actually overcome the effect of these chemicals. So on surviving, although some get killed, but some can survive. So you see, I'm trying to spray a particular area with chemicals or pests or using antibiotics to kill bacterial infections. Then some bacteria die while others survive the chemicals. or some pests die while others survive the chemicals. What happens? Those that survive reproduce. When they reproduce, they are transmitting that changed genetic information or that mutated aspect of their DNA to their next generation. So using antibiotics and pesticides repeatedly, or when these organisms or when these microorganisms get exposed to these pesticides and antibiotics repetitively, they actually undergo what we call mutation. So within the population, some individuals possess the gene for resistance or acquire it through mutation. Hence, they can actually survive. So as I'm spraying these chemicals like pesticides to kill these microorganisms, or I'm using these antibiotics to kill these bacteria, some bacteria and some pests contain a gene for resistance against the chemicals getting used or drugs getting used. Or some may have acquired that gene through mutation. On acquiring that gene, that makes them to survive the attack by the chemicals. Those that survive can transmit these characteristics to their offspring. So at the end of the day, we shall establish a new generation of bacteria and pests which are now resistant to the chemicals and antibiotics. So if a mutation occurs in a population of bacteria, the mutant bacteria will produce an enzyme that will break down the penicillin as an antibiotic. So continued use of penicillin fails to cure the disease or the bacterial infection. Let me repeat this. I actually end up having a group of bacteria causing some bacterial infections. I used penicillin, made by Penicillium, as a very good example of a fungi, to cure this bacterial infection. And then some bacteria mutate. They become mutant. They might have acquired this gene for resistance against the bacteria, the antibiotics through sexual reproduction. Or some just develop that change when these chemicals are used for a longer period of time. They become mutant, they produce an enzyme, the enzyme breaks down the penicillin or the drug. Some insects or some pests also acquire a gene for resistance, or they actually become mutated, they become mutants because of the prolonged use of the chemicals. They also produce an enzyme that works against the chemicals getting used against them to kill them. So if you look at insects like mosquitoes, they possess a gene which makes them to synthesize an enzyme. So that gene, they might have acquired it from their ancestral forms, or they might have actually developed it through what you call a mutation if the chemicals are used over them for a longer period of time. So they can work against DDT as an important pesticide to kill them. So you see, you're trying to look at mosquitoes as insects. They are going to cause malaria, more specifically, the Anopheles mosquito, the female Anopheles mosquito. More specifically, having a plasmodium that carries that infectious part as a toxoid into the body of a human being. I've actually used DDT as a very important insecticide to kill these mosquitoes. Some have a resisting or resistant gene. Some develop that gene to resist against the chemicals. That gene can actually help them to synthesize an enzyme. That enzyme can break down the DDT. This makes the DDT to become ineffective in the control of such insects. The control of Plasmodium has been made difficult due to the ability of the Plasmodium to rapidly change its coat surface antigens. So sometimes you are actually using DDT as a very important insecticide to kill the mosquito, the Plasmodium, to be more specific. The Plasmodium, in the process of actually having the chemical getting used over it for a longer period of time, ends up developing a resistant coating on its antigens. So this makes the Plasmodia resist the drug meant to kill it. So it's also very difficult for us to make a vaccine against Plasmodium, the one that causes malaria. So sometimes some strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that causes TB have actually been able to become resistant as well, because of either they're developing a gene when several antibiotics are actually used against it, or acquiring that resistant gene from the ancestral forms. It's very difficult for us to treat and cure or eradicate TB in the population because the mutant bacteria will live long enough to reproduce and multiply. So human attempts to eradicate various species of disease-causing microorganisms or different species of pests have resulted in evolution. I take a particular antibiotic to kill any bacterial infection causing tuberculosis or any infection that demands the use of penicillin. In the process, when I overuse or use these antibiotics for a longer period of time over these microorganisms, the bacteria in each case become mutants. They either develop a gene to become resistant or they acquire the gene for resistance from their parental forms. In the process, because of that mutation, they develop a coating on their antigens. So, no antibiotics can work against them. They become selected for. Those with no gene that can make them to become mutant resistant will get killed by it. Those that do not actually end up having the normal DNA structure or have what you call a mutant gene will actually be able to resist the antibiotics that get you to actually treat these infections. So this evolution has been brought about probably through the natural selection of the pathogens and pests resistant to whichever agent is actually employed in the control of these infectious diseases. Thank you so much, and that is the end of our topic.